Welcome back to our second day of the ucLADINO Symposium. Today begins with our keynote by Dr. Olga Borovaya of Stanford University, who will give her paper titled The Emergence of the Ladino-Speaking Community, Print Culture and Politics of Ottoman Jews in 16th-Century Salonica and Istanbul. Her talk will be followed by a short break, a panel on networks, a 1-hour lunch break, a panel on linguistics, and a final mini concert to close out the program. So without further delay, Olga Borovaya has taught Sephardi history and Ladino literature at Johns Hopkins University, Stanford, UC Davis, and other American universities. She is a co-organizer and contributor to the digitized Ladino library at the Sephardic Studies Project at Stanford University. Borovaya's research focuses on Sephardi history and Ladino print culture in the Ottoman Empire. Borovaya is the author of numerous articles on Sephardi culture and 3 books: Modernization of a Culture, Belles Lettres and Theater of Ottoman Jews at the Turn of the 20th Century in 2005, Modern Ladino Culture, Press, Belles Lettres and Theater in the Late Ottoman Empire in 2011, and The Beginnings of Ladino Literature, Moses Almocino and His Readers in 2017. Currently, she is finishing a book manuscript tentatively titled The 1840 Blood Libel on Rhodes, Ottoman Jews at the Dawn of the Tanzimat Reforms, that deals with the blood libel on Rhodes in 1840. Welcome, Olga.
Hi, thank you, Simone. Hi, everybody. Thank you for, coming or attending my talk. Simone and I have been in correspondence for a year and a half and a week fighting for the correct link. But now we're here, and I hope everything is going to be okay now. First, can you please show the first slide? Simone, are you going to show it?
Yes, opening it now.
No, okay. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to look at this text, which was written in, this excerpt was written in 1566. So what you see is a piece written by Moses Almocino, a rabbi, who is praising Sultan Suleiman for having murdered his children and his innocent grandchildren for the welfare of his subjects, because otherwise there could be a war and the innocent, defenseless subjects would be inconvenienced. So this is a bit strange, right? Suleiman is dead. It's not your typical colophon when you say, you know, may the Sultan reign forever until the Messiah comes. No, it's not written for the Ottomans because they can't even read it. It's written for the Jews. What is it? I think we don't need it anymore, Simone, thank you. What it is a piece of political writing, as you would probably agree with me. When Iberian refugees left the Iberian Peninsula in the 1490s, they didn't have a vernacular literature of their own, and their only purpose was to be able to continue living as Jews. But around 70 years later, they had a rather sophisticated political treatise, and even more than one, and it was written in their own vernacular. How did it happen so quickly? The short and cryptic answer to this question is the answer is in the idiosyncratic nature of the Sephardic immigration, emigration from the Iberian Peninsula and immigration to the Ottoman Empire. As everybody knows, everybody here knows, let's put it this way, in the 1490s, Iberian Jews found refuge, most of them found refuge in Portugal. But in less than 5 years later, they were faced with the same choice as in 1492 in Spain. By the way, when I say Spain or Italy, this is a shorthand, really, because you know there was no Spain and no Italy at this time, just because it's just faster. this way. Okay, so they faced the same choice in Portugal, but even worse. They were subjected to the shock of forcible conversion. I'm not talking about the psychological trauma for those people. What interests me here is their legal status. While they were Jews, while they had been Jews, they were out of reach for the Inquisition. But now, any action that showed that they were Jews or any denunciation could cost them their lives. Luckily, at this time, Portugal did not yet have the Holy Office. But those people, traumatized and scared, most of them immediately left. And of course, those Jews who escaped the mass conversion and those who were converted, and those were mainly poorer people. And the rabbis, who of course could not, the only thing they could do is being rabbis. So they left, and the easiest place was going to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and some European countries. But then the borders closed for mass immigration, and they reopened in 1507. But at that time, Sephardim, the conversos were allowed to leave Portugal only to go to Christian countries, for fear that if they went to Muslim countries, they would relapse. So those who wanted to go to the Ottoman Empire, they could only go via Europe. And finally, in 1536, the Holy Office was established in Portugal. And that was the end of it for most conversos. Most conversos realized that they had to leave, and some went to the Ottoman Empire and others went to Europe. And still, some of them stayed. Those were mainly people who had businesses, who had money, who needed, they were engaged in trade, and they hoped they would be able to survive. Some did and some did not. But the majority went to Europe. It was closed and it was open. They could go to Europe. I'm going to talk about the Nasi family. I'm sure that most of you know of Gracia Nasi and her nephew and son-in-law, Joseph Nasi. The reason I'm talking about them is not that they're the only family that emigrated from Portugal and then came to the Ottoman Empire. There were many people like that, of course, but just because this family is immediately relevant for my topic. When these people went to Europe, their life was not easy because they were conversos. They could not show, if they were crypto Jews, they could not show that they were practicing Judaism. And in fact, they practiced Judaism in strange ways. Some people would not eat pork, others would not work on Saturday. Someone was denounced for putting on a clean shirt every Friday night. And so some of them just wanted to be careful, like the Nasi family, and others already didn't know. They hadn't received any Jewish education. They actually did not know what to do. But even honest converso Christians, the new Christians, they had to be very careful and constantly alert, because people could be denounced for any reason, which had nothing to do with religion. For instance, Doña Gracia's Nasi's own sister denounced her, and Gracia was, but that happened later. So first, the Nasi family went to Antwerp because that's where they had their big business. It was a really big company. Then when the circumstances changed, they decided they would go to Venice. Venice was safe for the Jews, but remember, they were not Jews, they were conversos. So what was safe for the Jews was no good for conversos. And there, Doña Gracia Nasi was extremely rich. She was probably the richest person, the wealthiest Jewish family at the time. And her nephew, Joseph Nasi, spent a lot of time around European monarchs. He knew Queen Mary of the Netherlands, Charles V, and the future Roman Emperor Maximilian. So he had rich social experience. But after some time in Venice, they had to flee and they went to Ferrara. And in Ferrara, they openly returned to Judaism. And that's what made their life really intolerable. Their friend, the Sultan Suleiman's doctor, Moses Hamon, he asked Suleiman to help Dona Gracia Nassim. And that eventually, she didn't come to the Ottoman Empire right away, even though it was dangerous for her, because she had a lot to lose. She first wanted to move some of her wealth to the Ottoman lands, but not all of it, because she wanted to continue doing trade. So she eventually came to the Ottoman Empire in 1554, and her nephew stayed there to deal with some family affairs, to try to get all of their wealth, but he didn't succeed at that point. And then he joined her in 1555. Now, as I said, there were many people like that. Those were people who, first of all, they were affluent. They were, some of them quite educated, some were physicians, some were scholars, and they were merchants. Many of them went to European universities. So those were educated and people with a lot of, they had a rich social experience, and they were known for their social mobility, because if you think, one had to be quite adventurous to have to lead that really difficult life in Europe. So finally they decided it wasn't worth it, and they decided that they could only live in the Ottoman Empire where they could practice Judaism openly. And for them, it was very important. So they, having found themselves in this very favorable situation, these Jews decided that they wanted to replicate the royal alliance, which they remembered from Spain. So in Spain, the Jews paid almost all their taxes directly to the crown, for which the kings protected them. So the strong monarchy was the only real protector for the Jews. And they thought that this would work in the Ottoman Empire as well. But you have to remember that once they came to the Ottoman Empire, even though Dona Gracia was allowed to wear luxurious clothes, nevertheless, they came there as zimmis, that is the protected religious minority, just like Christians. They paid the poll tax, Jesus. That was all that they paid. And the crown, and then the Sultan already protected them, because that was the pact between the Sultan and his subjects. So, and unlike the Spanish kings, and unlike the Roman Emperor Charles V, Suleiman did not need money. He didn't need Jewish money in the same sense as the Spanish kings needed it. Well, what happened to the project is something we're going to discuss after this little break, but actually we're just changing gears and going back to those refugees who went directly to the Ottoman Empire. So you have masses of people from different parts of the Iberian Peninsula, speaking different dialects and languages, all of which were, as a matter of fact, mutually intelligible. Also, there were the Portuguese Jews, but Portuguese was then closer to Spanish than it is now, and many of them were bilingual. And eventually, they were also joined by a very small, relatively small group of Italian Jews. So a long-lasting contact between people speaking mutually intelligible varieties of the same language led to the emergence of a new language, Koine. So Koine, which means in Greek common language, is a new language that arises from this contact between mutually intelligible dialects. It does not affect the languages for which it emerged, and it does not replace it. Like, for instance, Middle English replaces Old English. No. In this Koine, it takes a few generations for a Koine to stabilize. So at first there is mixing, people speak different varieties, then there's leveling, and finally the last stage is focusing, or when you have multiple forms and usually the language chooses the simplest form, not always, but most of the time. And this is how the Ladino Koine emerged. It doesn't happen in one generation, it takes several generations, especially in the absence of mass media. And Aldina Quintana shows that there were actually 3 Koines in the Ottoman Empire, but they were formed at somewhat different at different times. However, this being a diglossic community, the diglossic Hebrew Jewish community, the language of high culture was still Hebrew. It was the language of law, religion, and education. Ladino was used at home, mainly. Although there was one book published in around 1510 in Ladino, which were the instructions for kosher slaughterers. Apparently, the rabbis were concerned about people not knowing what to do. The Jews Sephardic Jews brought their printing presses with them, but of course they could publish or print only Hebrew books. And then something interesting happened, and it's really unique, and I mean unique. It never happened before or after. When these conversos started coming to the Ottoman Empire, they had to be educated in normative Judaism, which of course they did not know, and they didn't know Hebrew. So learning Hebrew took time, and we see many Hebrew grammars printed at that time. So the only way to teach them was to teach them the Hebrew alphabet, which is pretty easy. And then the text was written, the vernacular text was written in Hebrew letters. That was easy because they knew the words. So this way they easily learned the letters. But that also meant that someone had to write for them to teach them in this language, in the vernacular, and talk about God and law, and that had never happened before. That had not been permissible until then. But under the circumstances, it was decided that this would be the best way. So first they published, the rabbis published prayer books, Siddur, in Ladino. In fact, also Siddur for. Then, then they published the translation of the Psalms, then the famous Constantinople Bible in 1547, and some other parts of the Bible. But this Ladino is very difficult to read. I'm sure some of you have seen it. It's what's called the cock language. It's really hard to make sense of. And it's only used for translation of religious texts. And these people, these conversos, had questions and wanted to discuss. And the only language they would read was the vernacular in Hebrew characters. One of the people, rabbis, particularly dedicated to the education or re-education of the conversos was Moses Almosnino, Rabbi Moses Almosnino, who was born in Salonica in 1518 and died in Istanbul in 1580. He was a very open-minded rabbi. He was erudite. He was very interested in sciences. He clearly owned books in Latin script. And I've shown in my book that he read, actually, books published in Spain and Italy. And he, for some reason, he was very interested in re-educating these new conversos. And when in 1559, Doña Gracia Nasi founded a synagogue for the Portuguese conversos in Salonica, she appointed Rabbi Almosnino its first rabbi, and he served there for 10 years. And he accepted the appointment under the condition that these people would come twice a week, except for Shabbat, and learn. So he spent time with these people, most of whom were rather wealthy and educated. And he formed many connections also in Istanbul with the conversos. But as I see, he started traveling to Istanbul much earlier, before the Nazis even immigrated. And he had contacts, for instance, he had a mutual friend with the chief Deftergar, the treasurer, Suleiman's treasurer. So we don't know exactly why he went. I think he had business of his own. But in any case, someone recommended him to the Nicene family. So they appointed him rabbi of that synagogue. And he had to travel to Istanbul pretty often to talk to them, to discuss the affairs of the synagogue, but certainly other things. At the Nasi residence in Belvedere. So some of these people asked him questions, including Joseph Narcissus himself, that he considered worth writing books about, like the nature of dreams, or he decided to write the Regimiento de la Vida, his probably best known book, so not the most interesting one, The Regimen of Living. And these books were published in Salonica in 1564. In these, he was the first vernacular author known to us, because manuscripts did not survive, so we don't know. But as far as we know, he was the first vernacular author, and he was the first original author, meaning that he did not translate or write anything. He really wrote books from scratch. And thirdly, he was the first secular author. I mean, he was a rabbi, but he, in addition to his Hebrew theological treatises and commentaries, he wrote really secular literature. And when he sort of happened that he was also very active in this, and he was sent to as the member of a delegation to Istanbul to deal with the taxes, his community's taxes. He spent there 2 years. And as is clear from what he says, these his friends, the Nicene family, Moses Hamon, also Judah de Segura, another physician at the court, who else? Abraham Salama, and there were many people like that who apparently persuaded him to write a book. For at first they wanted him to, and when he came there, very soon after that, in the fall of 1566, Suleiman died, and Selim was enthroned. Now, Nassi was very close with Prince Selim and then Sultan Selim, who was also known as a drunkard, and Joseph Nassi was dealt in wines. So he obviously got the best wines for the Sultan, for the prince. And so they asked Al-Musnino to talk about the death of Suleiman and the enthronement of his son, Selim II. That is what Al-Musnino did. And he did such a good job that very soon they asked him to write a chronicle of Ottoman kings, the kings before Sultan Suleiman. And he did it too. In these books are what I call political treatises. Now, Simone, if you could show the second slide. So the second, this is an excerpt from the first book. I'm sorry, yeah, it's the enthronement of Selim, Sultan Selim. So what we see here, Al-Musnino describes how Selim came to Istanbul, how he was met and welcomed by the residents who went outside, and they met him, they welcomed him with presents. This text is extremely interesting. Actually, I have a whole article about this short text because there's so much in it. Well, to begin with, this is the first detailed description of the parade of the guilds, which later became an Ottoman, very popular Ottoman genre of Ottoman literature and miniature painting. But what interests us here is that we now see the Jews were members of guilds already in the 16th century, and those were Muslim urban institutions. But what does Al-Musnino want us to learn from this? Well, first of all, he wants to assert his readers. He wants to assert them that Jews are visible in Istanbul. We don't really know whether the whether Jews were overrepresented really in trade and crafts, or whether he exaggerated, because the population of Istanbul and Tramuros was 250,000, and there were only 18,000 Jews. So that's a small percent. So it's hard to tell. But what's more important for me here is not what actually happened, but what he wanted the readers to see. So he wanted to see, first of all, that they were prominent, that they were affluent, because being a member of the guild meant implied being affluent, and they gave the Sultan their very these expensive textiles. And by the way, scarlet is not the color here. Scarlet cloth is a kind of cloth. Also, he shows that the Jews of Istanbul are faithful to the Sultan, and finally, that they join together with the Muslims and Christians and the foreigners in welcoming the Sultan, and they, together with the others, say amen to him. So you have this rather idyllic picture. Now, how did Al-Musnino learn about it? He was in Istanbul, it's true, and people think of his book as a travelogue. He described what he saw. But if you look more carefully, you see that he says that Selim's face showed contentment. But how could he see it? He was inside the city, as he tells us. He was in a shop. So who saw it? Someone who was riding next to the Sultan. And there was no doubt Joseph Nassi. So all this information, and of course, it's just a small illustration, a lot more Al-Musnino learned from Joseph Nassi, and he learned it the way the Nassi and the rest of the group wanted him to see it and present it. Here we clearly see the source of his information. He often says someone who's very competent, someone who is Ottoman. And in many cases, we can guess who these people are. And not everything came from Nassi, because he described the sultans who reigned before Suleiman, and the Nassis were not there, and before the, so he got this information from other sources. So this is just one illustration. Of course, as I said, we can say many things about this text, but you see this picture of unity. He wrote these two chronicles to educate his coreligionists about the Ottoman Empire, again, in the way he wanted them to be educated. That is why he writes this panegyric, which we started, where he explains that Suleiman is such a wonderful and really great king, because he killed his family to ensure the safety of his subjects. He's not trying to tell them stories that he was so kind. No, just telling them the truth. Yes, he killed them, but that is for our sake. Then he tells a story about Joseph Nassi, which I'm not going to discuss here. But the point of the story is that you don't have to be, as he puts it, a Turk of their nation. You just have to be faithful, and you will be able to succeed in this wonderful empire. So again, clearly, he formulates the idea of the project of the Royal Alliance. Now, as I said before, Suleiman did not need direct, ready money, and he already protected his subjects. And then in 1574, Selim died, and the Sultan who replaced him, Murad III, was not interested in wines, in Jews, although he still had some Jewish doctors and diplomats. By the end of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire enters a crisis, economic crisis, a monetary crisis, and Salonica felt that very badly. And that is usually the reason given to explain why it didn't work. But I think it didn't work because an alliance implies that both sides are interested, and where the other side that interested in it, and to put it in make it clearer, I want Simone to show us the third slide. And this third slide, you'll be surprised. This slide. It's taken from the first Ladino periodical that came out in 1846. And it describes, curiously, it describes Sultan Abdul Majid's vaccination trip. So he made a tour of the European part of the Ottoman Empire, vaccinated children, and gave a golden piece to each child. And so the editor of this first Ladino periodicals thanks him for that. And he seemingly said the same thing. He said, okay, we're all children of this country. And we have this wonderful Sultan, and we're going to build a new world together with him. We're going to join our efforts and going to be faithful, and everything is going to be great because our rights are not going to be diminished because of our faith. Faith is really a matter of conscience. That's very modern, right? And so it has nothing to do with who we are. This is extremely optimistic, and we know why, because this is the beginning of the Tanzimat reforms, and the Jews and Christians took very seriously the Mechanic Reman that promised equality, and they thought that that was going to something. They saw something like the abolishment of the Zima, which didn't happen. I mean, it happened much later. So you would think that this is the same kind of flattery and the same kind of optimism. But this time we know that it did work. Work in the sense that the other side, that was the Ottomans, they did want an alliance with the Jews. Well, they surely needed money, and they needed money from Ottoman Jews and from the Rothschild, because the country really was in poor shape. But that's not the only reason. Probably they could have gotten money without all this rhetoric. They were interested in the Jews because the treatment of a country's Jewish subjects suddenly became a criterion of its legal fitness. So European countries were now interested, and they followed the treatment of Jews and the Christians and all non-Muslim subjects. So, and that is why the Ottomans were, apart from being interested in money, they were interested in representation. So it was sort of for the PR. And I suppose most of you have read Julia Coy's wonderful book, Becoming Ottomans. So she describes a very similar phenomenon that happens at the turn of the 20th century, when again, Ottoman Jews offer the Sultan the Sublime Porte, they offer their cooperation, and they also are in an alliance. I see that most people, especially young people, that people are not very interested in the 16th century. They write about the 19th and 20th century. This is true for linguistics, history, and literature. And I chose this subject because I want to show to you that's a very interesting period, and that we really need new young scholars to work on it, even though there's some very good work. And it is true that these political aspirations of these conversos, they did not have any consequences. It's true, they're followed by a little hiatus, but it doesn't matter. It provides a context, and also it's a term of comparison. And I very much hope that I've been able to interest you in the 16th century, and that some of you will want to turn to it in your work. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have a Let's take questions now. You can start typing your questions into the Q&A.
Can presenters ask questions? I'm not really sure how to type it in.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Borovaya, very nice talk. I enjoyed the historical perspective. I'm wondering if you have looked into any kind of revisionist attitudes, especially regarding the Jewish influence in Ottoman Turkey. There is a soap opera, I don't know if you heard about it, it's called Mühteşem Yüzyıl, in which there are Jewish characters there, especially Joseph Nancy and Doña Gracia is in that soap opera, and their characters are not in very good light. They're kind of like the villains of the story, and really emphasize the influence that they played on the sultans. Have you looked into any kind of revisionist attitudes for that period?
Revisionist, I think my perspective is actually revisionist because normally they are presented as these people who come that the Sultan Suleiman, or that actually is Bayezid and Salam I and Suleiman invited them to come, and that they were happily sitting under their wives there, and that they were, and this myth of the Jews being invited, that's been pretty popular until very recently. And I'm saying, no, it's not like they were, they owed the Suleiman all that much. They wanted to create, they had a political agenda, and they tried to implement it, but it failed for predictable reasons. And whether they were nice or not, that's another story. They were not probably nice to their rivals, for sure. But for instance, I can tell you that Joseph Nassi was friends with Rustem Pasha, the Grand Vizier, who was involved directly in the murder of Suleiman's other children. So I don't know whether it makes Joseph Nassi nice or not, but that's the story. And Doña Gracia Nassi accomplished so many things in her life. She's very courageous. She chose a very difficult life. And she probably was hard, probably rough. She probably was not a sweetheart. But that's as much as we know, I think. And I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the soap opera, but I know that Joseph Nassi was Christian authors in the 16th, 17th century presented him as a villain, which he probably was. I just don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly how they're portrayed in the series. I mean,
Duke of Naxos, you know what he did? He stopped all French ships and he put an embargo so that they would not, until he got all the wealth he left in France. So they wouldn't give it to him. So he just took it from them. And of course, I didn't mention that these people were so powerful that in 1556, Doña Gracia was able to have this boycott of the Rancone because it was papal city and 24 conversos were burned on the stake. And then allegedly, Selim offered to Joseph Nassi to make him prince of his principalities, Moldavia or Wallachia or something like that, but we don't know for sure. He didn't accept, but he certainly had a lot of clout there too in diplomacy.
Okay, thank you so much.
We have another question. Were the Romaniote Jews treated as well by the Ottomans as were the Sephardic Jews that emigrated to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century?
No, they were not treated nicely. So the Romaniote Jews were living there, and when the Ottomans, when they conquered Istanbul, or Constantinople, and because many people left this city, which was renamed, became Istanbul, Mehmed had his famous Sürgün policy, which means a transfer, forcible transfer of people from one city to another, also very modern city. So he moved Jews, for instance, he took all Jewish families from Salonica were moved to Istanbul. And that happened to many other Jews. And later, and then Suleiman already, he moved some Jews from Salonica to Rhodes, but those were Sephardic Jews. But of course, the Romanian Jews were very much affected by the conquest, and also they were treated really unequally. So the Romanian Jews in Istanbul had to live in their neighborhoods. They were not allowed to change their location. It was the ghetto, but they could not go to live to other places. Whereas Sephardim came with money, and probably no less important, with great connections in Europe, trade connections. They were treated differently. Wherever they wanted, as long as it was not too close to mosques. And until a big fire, when everything got mixed up, then the Romaniots and Sephardim lived separately. But then something else happened. So the Iberian Jews Sephardized the Romaniots. Eventually, they left. They stopped speaking Greek. They started speaking Ladino. Finally, mixed marriages. At first, there were no intermarriage. Then suddenly it all changed after the fire. And so, I guess they were treated nicely when they were no longer Romaniots. Well, I guess one can say more about it as far as facts, but that's the main idea. No equality at all. That actually tells you that it is ridiculous to say that the Ottomans loved Jews. Of course not. I mean, they loved or did not love them, but it's just not, it's an irrelevant term because they were not nice to Romaniots and they were very nice to Sephardim, both being Jews. It's just beside the point. Have I answered?
Yes, I think so. Do we have any other questions? There's the Q&A box is at the bottom of the Zoom window next to the raise hand function, and you can type your questions in there.
Yeah, may I ask a question? I'm not able to type into the box, Simone.
Yes, go ahead.
Olga, thank you for this presentation. This just popped into my head, actually. It hadn't occurred to me when I previously saw the quotes. And this is maybe a historiographical kind of, inside the profession kind of question, but in Middle East studies, I think, when we're studying Muslims, for example, I think a lot has been written ever since Said and Orientalism about making connections across long swaths of time, lest we essentialize certain groups. And it's often frowned upon to say, well, if it was Ottoman Muslims, to say, well, we have this text in the 16th century, and now look at this newspaper article from the 19th century, and we can see the connections for many reasons, right? A lot of people argue that kind of thing is essentializing Muslims in a way that we wouldn't do that to, say, like British people, for example. I mean, do you think, to what extent can we do that with Ottoman Jews, to sort of draw these parallels? And even Simone, I think in your talk too. I mean, and I'm not saying, I don't know how I feel about this. It's an honest question. To what extent do you think we can, trace these motifs that recur throughout Ottoman history from the 16th century to the 19th in the Jewish case?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jake. Of course, no connections. I just emphasize that there are no connections, but because certainly it would be silly to say that because they're Jews, they want the same thing. It's just human beings and they want to live comfortably, right? That makes sense. But since here we are, doing Jewish studies, and I wanted to show the audience, I don't do it in my book, by the way, if you've read it, but I wanted, no, actually I do. I wanted to show that the 16th century is not a different world. That's what but of course, essentializing is something that I don't do. Are you satisfied, Jay? Do you want to ask more?
Yes, no, that's helpful. Thank you, Olga.
No, just, because I read so many Ladino texts and I see it and it just slips by, right? And what can I say? It's amazing. And so I have a question. Is it the same? And do they succeed in recreating the Royal Alliance? So that's why I thought other people might also be interested. And maybe they go back to the 16th century.
I mean, I'll just say my last thing here. I mean, I do it myself sometimes in my own writing. I talk about Royal Alliance coming back in the early 20th century. So I'm not necessarily criticizing, I'm thinking about my own work too, but that's helpful. Thank you.
It is certainly perfectly fine to criticize me, as you know. It's very helpful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jake. Are there any more questions? If not, then I'd like to ask you, Olga, if you could tell us more about the manuscript that you're working on currently.
Oh, gladly. So I'm working on this book on the Rhodes blood libel that Simon mentioned. So it is not a history of anti-Semitism. It is, that's why the second part of the title is Ottoman Jews at the Dawn of the Tanzimat. I want to take a look at what happened to Ottoman Jews, how they perceived the changed world in 1840. And of course, there's very little material on that. And then because there is this blood libel, actually not studied at all, which itself, it's important to study it. But then because of this blood libel, we have a significant amount of materials there. And through these materials, through the way things were done, the way the Jews were treated, the way they perceived it, we can tell a lot about the life of Ottoman Sephardim in 1840. So in one chapter, I talk about the resolution of the blood libel crisis, that actually Ottomans, the Porte played a very significant role in resolving this crisis because for whatever reason, because they want to advertise their reforms, so when I discuss the way they resolve the crisis, you can see what's going on and how Sephardic Jews are treated. Then the chapter I just finished, which deals with the responses of Rhodian Jews to the blood libel and how they changed. That's another, this is another question. And I look at it diachronically because I have texts from 1840 and then the latest texts are from the 1880s. And first of all, we see how the perception, and eventually what we get in the 1880s, it's not a Purim song, it's already someone, unfortunately we don't know who it is, who writes comments on the margins, just trying to explain, trying to find out who these people were, about, when this happened, just very small, looking for little facts, little details, like we usually do. My other question here is how they explain the blood libel. And I believe that the answer is that the Jews were very smart. They knew right away that it wasn't just their own sins or any sins. It was because of the economic rivalry. In my case, it's not so much with the Christian Greek Orthodox, but with Europeans. But the genre, such as poem couplets, for instance, that required that they talk about, and especially because those that were written by rabbis, this required that they talk about their sins and how this was punishment for their sins. But really, they didn't think it was punishment for their sins. And the less restrictive the genre is, the freer they talk about it. And in oral transmission, they don't even mention any sins or retribution or anything like that. They just say, okay, there was an economic rivalry, they want to get rid of us. And I think this is true not just for Northern Jews, and I'm sure that's true for all other Sephardic Jews. I can't speak for the Ashkenazi Jews, but I would think the same thing. And of course, there was a lot of work just like smoothing. I had to really find out what happened because Jonathan Frankel, as we know, wrote a brilliant book, The Damascus Affair. He didn't know anything about the Rosebud libel. And everybody assumed always that this was the same thing. No, I'm sure it was a pure coincidence. So, and I have to show that too.
Thank you.
A lot of enough marketing here.
Welcome back, everyone. Now it's time to start our first panel of the day on networks. The following presentations will be 15 minutes in length, followed by a Q&A at the end. Audience members may submit their questions for the speakers through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, while panelists can message me directly with their questions. Our first speaker, Jacobo Sefami, is the grandson of Sephardic Jews who emigrated to Mexico City from Turkey and Syria. He is currently professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of California, Irvine. And he is also director of Middlebury College's Summer School of Spanish. He publishes articles, interviews, notes, and book reviews for various literary journals in Mexico, Spain, Venezuela, Chile, and the US. His books concentrate on Latin American poetry. He has also taught, lectured, and published on various Jewish Latin American writers. His novel, Los Dolientes, translated and published in English in 2010 as Mourning for Papa, a story of a Syrian Jewish family in Mexico, explores the rituals of mourning in the context of Syrian Jews in Mexico City. He co-edited with Miriam Moscona Por Mi Boca in 2013, a selection of texts in Ladino. His latest books are El Camaleón y la Esponja, David Huerta in 2019, Por Tierras Extrañas, Stories and Travel Chronicles of 2019, Mili en lo Inacabo Mutante, Poems in 2019, and Kaleidoscopia, Escrituras y Poéticas de lo Oblicuo en América Latina in 2021.
Thank you, Simone. Last time we met was the presentation of this book, Por Tierras Extrañas, here at UCI, and it was actually the last event I attended in public. So thank you for Simone for the invitation. Andrea was there too, singing, so it's melancholy. In any case, I have to say that I will read in Spanish. If some of you don't know Spanish, you can take a longer break and skip my presentation. I'm going to read excerpts from my book, Por Tierras Extrañas, and these excerpts relate to my chronicles of travel in Turkey in 2015. And so in search of my own family roots. So I'll start. Árboles lloran por lluvias, en Estambul te voy a buscar. Fragmentos de crónicas de viaje. Pamuk y yo. Estamos a punto de despegar y leo las primeras páginas de Istanbul, Memories and the City, de Orhan Pamuk. Me impacta su inicio. Dice haber pensado desde muy pequeño, a los 5 años de edad, el tener un hermano gemelo o su doble que vivía en otra casa, en otra casa semejante a la suya, ubicada en una calle parecida de Estambul. Ese otro yo lo obsesionaba en su infancia y adolescencia, ya sea como fantasma, fantasía o pesadilla. Cuando me sentía, y leo de Pamuk, cuando me sentía desdichado, comenzaba a imaginar que iría a otra casa, a otra vida, al lugar donde vivía el otro Orhan, y de repente empezaba a creerme un poco que yo era ese otro Orhan, y me entretenía con los sueños de felicidad. Esos sueños me hacían tan feliz que yo no sentía la necesidad de irme a otra casa. Luego veo con pasmo, y quiero compartir mi pantalla. I'm going to share my screen. Sorry. Luego veo con pasmo que Pamuk y yo somos parecidos, al menos según las fotos que aparecen de él de niño. Me imagino que yo podría ser ese doble de Pamuk, aunque nacido en otra ciudad y en otro continente. Luego reflexiono que esa noción del otro pasa por mi mente, pero ya no tanto en referencia al niño que fui, sino al adulto. ¿A qué voy a Turquía si no es a buscarme a mí mismo, ese otro desconocido para mí, pero a la vez idéntico a mí con los mismos genes? ¿Quién será ese otro Jacobo que deambula en las calles de Estambul e imagina a su gemelo emigrado que come tacos y hamburguesas? Quizás sea esa necesidad de verme como otro, trasplantado en la ausencia de mí. Es ese espacio también de la infancia en que me arrebataron a Mili, mi hermana, sí, a los 5 años míos, mi casi gemela que voló hecha trizas, arrollada por un automóvil. Seguramente esa fractura, esa muerte que internalicé tantos años, aflore de muchas maneras, me haga seguir buscando inútilmente ese otro yo elusivo e imposible. Balat, la conciencia del exilio. Camino por la mañana en el barrio de Balat. Se parece a la colonia Roma en México, de antaño, la pobre, no la actual que se ha puesta de moda. Todos se me hacen conocidos, me miran como si siempre hubiera vivido allí, el sefardí que nunca abandonó su tierra. Voy rodeado de manadas de perros que no veía desde mi infancia, sintiendo otra vez miedo. ¿Se podrá tener nostalgia del miedo? De que me ataquen. También hay muchísimos gatos callejeros, saltan entre tejados, van por las calles transversalmente, se acuestan en las repisas de las ventanas, durmiendo. Nunca había visto tantos en mi vida. En una esquina, varias mujeres hablan en árabe y se me olvida que estoy en Turquía, pero pronto me doy cuenta que son refugiadas de Siria. Al dar la vuelta paso por una escuela. Los niños se están formando en el patio interior, tal vez para entonar el himno turco. Una niña de 9 años corre hacia mí, abriendo sus brazos, para que yo la levante y le dé un beso, como si fuera su padre. La mamá, que viene detrás, le grita, tal vez regañándola. Yo no sé cómo reaccionar, salvo que guardo prudente distancia, y la niña se da cuenta en el último instante antes de abrazarme que no soy quien ella suponía que yo era, y voltea a ver a su madre con lágrimas en los ojos. Supongo por el tono y la voz que la madre me pide disculpas por la confusión. Yo le respondo con gestos que no se preocupe y me despido tocando con la palma de la mano el corazón. Sorry, I'm gonna show you this one. Veo la sinagoga derruida donde ofició Istipol o la memoria desconocida. Veo la sinagoga derruida donde ofició el rabino David Sefami, quizá mi bisabuelo o algún miembro de la familia. El barrio pobre, la gente que pasa sin percibir que tomo fotos, ansioso. Isaac, mi guía, se ha puesto a hablar con unos vecinos sobre unas elecciones municipales y yo me he quedado solo. Viene hacia mí un hombre joven de mi misma complexión, tiene el cabello negro, la nariz achatada como la mía, las pestañas largas. Lleva una chamarra ligera, beige, igual a una que dejé de usar hace 20 años. Le sonrío sin decir nada. Él me mira y comienza a hablarme en turco. No entiendo nada de lo que dice. Me quedo un instante sin emitir palabras. Volteo buscando a Isaac para que me ayude, pero no está por ningún lado. El joven me ve, desalentado, incrédulo. Se va hacia arriba, gesticulando con las manos. Me encojo de hombros y vuelvo a pensar en la sinagoga incendiada hace más de 100 años, aunque la reconstruyeron, nunca recobró su vigor antiguo. Toco la piedra, los ladrillos que conforman la pared del exterior. Me quedo unos momentos más allí sin saber qué hacer, como si se tratara de un santuario. Las señoras que pasan me ven intrigadas, sin entender por qué abro las manos y recorro la superficie del muro. No saben que lo hago para ver si una migaja de ese mundo misterioso de mi pasado se remueve. Tal vez un hálito, un silencio oscuro delate al rabí y abra las puertas y esclarezca un algo de la memoria. El Hushun del judeo español. Vamos a la sinagoga de Etz Haim en un barrio que se llama Ortacoy, pegado al Bósforo y próximo al puente que cruza Asia. Se trata de un templo moderno semejante a otro que pudiera estar en Polanco, en México. Acaba de terminar la fiesta de un bar mitzvah. Hay todavía mucha comida en largas mesas de un salón destinado para el banquete. Están desmontando el equipo de sonido. En el patio del centro nos encontramos con una pareja. Tendrán unos 80 años de edad. Son bajos de estatura y aparentan buena salud. Se acercan para preguntar quiénes somos, sonrientes. Isaac les explica que estoy de visita, que vengo de muy lejos y les pregunta si saben ladino. Responden que sí. Yo me alegro de mi hallazgo fortuito e inicio una breve conversación. ¿Hablan judeo-español? Sí, español mos hablamos. ¿De dónde sos? Soy de México. ¡Ah, México! Nosotros somos de la España que vinimos. Hay 550 años que vinieron los judíos de la España a la Turquía, dice él como si yo fuera un reportero. En tiempos de Isabela y Ferdinand que nos metieron a la puerta, continúa ella riendo como si se tratara de una ocurrencia traviesa. A mí me divierte esa manera tan suave de referirse a la expulsión. Me hace pensar que en su imaginario lo importante es la casa que se tiene que abandonar, la puerta que se cierra, la llave que no abrirá ninguna casa y que quedará como emblema de lo que fue una época de esplendor. La música, la comida, la cultura que resisten los embates del tiempo y que son la persistencia pura de la memoria. Pero la lengua ahora se volatiza, se muere. ¿Y tú ande moras? ¿Por qué ya no habla ladino la gente? En ladino las palabras en turco y en español ya se mezclaron. No entiendo esta explicación. ¿Por cuál es que vinites? Para saber de mi familia, los Sefami, que eran de aquí. Su abuelo fue rabino en Balad, se apura a señalarles Isaac. Ah, de Balad no puedes topar aquí. Me lo dicen como si Balad estuviera en otra parte del mundo. En el taxi no hemos tardado ni una hora en llegar a Ortacoy. Isaac es de Balad, le respondo. Lo ven intrigados y le preguntan no sé qué cosas en turco. Ella me indica tratando de ayudarme en mi búsqueda. Si te vas en Yom Shabbat a la Keilah de Balad, a Arida, allá topas con tu familia. Asiento con la cabeza. En México, ¿cómo estás? Bien. Aquí no estamos buenos. De pronto sus rostros se tornan sombríos, tristes. Ella aclara con cierto dolor. El presidente no es bueno con los judíos. ¿Cuántos judíos hay en México? Entre 40 y 50,000. Aquí no hay ni 10, explica él ansioso. Isaac dice que hay 16,000. No, ahora hay mucho aliá, todos se van, contesta él rebatiendo la información aceptada con las conversaciones cotidianas de la comunidad. Se aproxima otra pareja mucho más joven. Tuvimos bar mitzvah de mi nieto, es mi hija y mi yerno, nos explica él. Más alto, sus hijos ya no hablan ladino, solo los viejos, me lo apunta él como si fuera una obviedad que hay que admitir. Salimos de la sinagoga, comienza a atardecer, el viento sopla más fuerte y está nublado. Recuerdo que Pamuk identifica el temperamento turco con la palabra hüzün, que quiere decir melancolía. En la tradición mística sufí deriva de la angustia de no poder estar cerca de Dios, pero la aplica al colectivo, a todos los habitantes de la ciudad, agregándole un algo de dejadez, de decadencia. Con una lengua en peligro de extinción, ahora pienso en el Kuzun del judeo español, en esos espacios turcos donde la lengua dejó de ser, en el alma de los que la recuerdan solo emparentada con su niñez, en la memoria de los que hablan con los muertos, en la tristeza del Bósforo en que sopla el viento y se lleva las embarcaciones hacia el frío del Mar Negro, en la neblina del anochecer que todo lo torna oscuro, en la mirada perdida que evoca el pasado pletórico, en las piedras que quedan solo como ecos reverberantes de templos que ahora solo rebotan los sonidos en la nada, en las púas de alambrados que protegen vestigios de un esplendor inexistente, en las ruinas ignoradas de un ser que deambula perdido, en las calles decrépitas, en los edificios desvencijados, en los árboles y las montañas y los aires y los ojos de esta ciudad tan deseada y querida e ignorada, acá en el exilio que da vueltas como una serpiente que se muerde la cola, en el alma que se va y que vuelve. El judeo español da sus últimos coces, relincha fuerte, exhala quedito, con voces susurrantes que van poco a poco diluyéndose. Ese otro yo, escudriño a cada uno de los hombres que encuentro en el camino para ver si me reconozco. Sí, pero no, digo en mis adentros. Se parecen, podrían ser familiares o conocidos, pero no, no son. Me encontraré con Orhan Pamuk en este cuerno de oro. Saldrá con sus amigos a la calle y lo veré de frente, alto, delgado y guapo, como si fuera la antítesis, el negativo de la foto que me revela mi propia cara. Le diré que lo he estado buscando desde hace siglos. Él me verá a los ojos por un segundo y seguirá hablando al micrófono de alguien que lo entrevista, pasando a mi lado sin voltear. Yo le diré a su sombra, Pamuk, soy yo, ¿no me reconoces? Soy ese otro que se fue, que huye despavorido por el mundo, que busca afanosa e infructuosamente a ese ser inexistente más allá de los mares y de los ríos. Mi vida es una fuga y todo lo pierdo y todo es del olvido. Dame la mano, ayúdame a cruzar la calle, otórgame fuerzas para que Mili emerja de nuevo y hable en la tierra con el lenguaje de las nubes. So that's it. I just want to mention, in case somebody's interested, to write to me directly about my book. I will be glad to send a copy to you if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark Angel. Mark Angel was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. His family roots came via the island of Rhodes, which was a part of the Ottoman Empire, when his dad emigrated in 1912 to America. In Los Angeles, he was part of various Sephardic congregations, including the Maccabean Hebrew Center and Temple Tiferet Israel. His family is quite large and part of the greater Sephardic community in Los Angeles and Seattle. As Mark matured, he changed his perspective. He realized this more and more during many travels to various parts of Europe, discovering that his history was connected to so many of these peoples that aren't part of a global diaspora. In 2011, he founded Our Sephardic Family, a Facebook group, which now has more than 5,200 members worldwide. Although he is retired, he has held events in Los Angeles and Berkeley in addition to recent Zoom events. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank Simone and ucLADINO for hosting this event and inviting me to speak today. Before I get into my spiel, let me just add a few things to what Simone shared. I was born in Los Angeles in the mid-half of last century, and my dad was born in Rhodes in 1907, emigrating to the United States in 1912. My mom was born in Seattle in 1916 with her parents coming from Rhodes. I'm here to talk about Our Sephardic Family. Let's explore the significance of this title for a moment. When we examine the term family in this context, it does not infer blood relatives. It is intended to denote a group of people who choose to embrace a common bond. One Webster definition of family states, a group of people united by certain convictions or common affiliation, a fellowship. I pose the question now. What do Rio de Janeiro, Tbilisi, Georgia, and Johannesburg, South Africa have in common? These are a few of the places where members of our Sephardic family reside around the globe. The name was Our Sephardic Family, created in 2011. And I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about my younger years. Growing up in a city rich with Sephardic history, I was blessed to be surrounded by a rich diversity of Jewish and Sephardic culture. Family was a big part of my life. When I was growing up, I remember my mom explaining how I was related to various cousins. It was all by word of mouth. It was overwhelming, such a large family. Well, I must say, I took a lot of it for granted, never appreciated or understood our culture. As I matured, I changed my perspective. And I must confess that I'm convinced that how now I really cherish my heritage and what I can do to expand our global appreciation of this amazing culture that I am part of. More than a religion, I believe our Sephardic culture and all of its facets is really something to be proud of. I began to realize that going beyond the shores of roads, we really need to explore every avenue of our diaspora to appreciate the immense impact it has had on the world. My question would be, what does Sephardim mean to us? What's really cool is that I'm finding that this is really a two-part question, since there's a basic question of understanding Sephardim in addition to what us represents. Our Sephardic family includes marriages with other cultures, in addition to those people who are not even Jewish, but have a great affinity for certain cultural aspects, such as music or genealogy. In some cases, people of other religions are now just discovering that some of their roots are from those Jews in Spain who went underground and are now referred to crypto-Jews. I'm proud to say that I created our Sephardic family, and we just celebrated our 10th anniversary with a membership of over 5,000 on 6 continents. You may ask, what's the significance of this group? What does our Sephardic family really mean anyway? Since Sephardim spans the globe, it is only fitting that there are no limits to our membership. The group does have some rules. Don't post anything that might be offensive to your family. Please don't post political statements, report offensive posts. Don't use this group for commercial purposes. And it's helpful for new members to answer a few questions. And some of the questions that I pose are just for people to tell us about why you want to join our Sephardic family. Where did you emigrate from? And are you a member of any other Sephardic groups? And what's your favorite? When I ask new members, please tell us about you and your family. This opens up a dialogue for this extraordinary community of our Sephardic family. A dialogue that continues and continues to expand as we all learn and share our appreciation about our Sephardic heritage and legacy. I think about our Sephardic family, the shared heritage that gives people a sense of personal identity and belonging in a common group in this fragmented, chaotic world. What a resource and refuge. What I began in my own wonder and curiosity is now a platform where members can share and better understand previous generations and the history of their family's origin. The networking is remarkable. All the traces of artistic expression, language, history, music, religious traditions, customs of food, and even humor are on the table for questions and often lively discussion. The sense of community is strong. I believe that the best way to preserve our Sephardic family is to keep it alive. The daily posts and exchange in dialogues enrich lives individually as well as on the whole. Here is an example of a question posed to members of our Sephardic family. What, in your opinion, are the key benefits of being a member of our Sephardic family? How has the platform impacted your life? Here are some of the responses. I have recently joined and love learning more about our Sephardic culture, families, and history. Thank you for hosting this wonderful group. It's a way to know and keep up to date on Sephardic life and culture in our days. It's the only door to an important piece of my past and brings memories that would otherwise never be retrieved. It has a connection with me with other Sephardim, which is really important. Ever since I moved from Los Angeles to Wichita, Kansas, I missed my community. This group enabled me to learn more about culture and connect. I love and are proud of my heritage and my roots, and the site keeps me centered. So those are just a few of the comments, and I thought that was very special to me. In the group, some of the more popular genres of discussion are food, music, Ladino language, customs, community, genealogy, and family. Over the years, I've held events in Northern and Southern California, bringing together people to learn more about our culture, where I had guest speakers and presenters talking about areas of interest. Recently, I've expanded into the virtual realm, allowing us to include folks from around the world using the Zoom platform. I'm always looking for fine-tuning opportunities. I ask questions like, what are key issues and areas of interest? What is most important issue for you? And for me, there are so many things to understand, so many reasons to study history. I've been learning more about Ottoman Empire, the Inquisition, and learning more about where Sephardics are living all over the world. Our Sephardic family has opened up many doors. This is a legacy to be proud of and invaluable. We are the guardians who must pass this beautiful culture to our communities, which go beyond friends and family. It is more valuable than any monetary gift we can bestow. Our Sephardic family has successfully gained global reach on the internet to connect and strengthen our heritage in every corner of the world. The ongoing nature of this platform enables continuous growth and diversity of enrichment. In this time of social revolution brought about by social media, the world has become smaller. This has enabled a myriad of platforms to grow and thrive. The Facebook group, Our Sephardic Family, has grown into one of the many global catalysts. Within this forum, we have all benefited by interaction of ideas, and we continue to be treated to more pride in our Sephardic culture. Some of the benefits include rediscovering our Sephardic identity, interacting with other Sephardim, and understanding their stories. Finding our cultural heritage, including genealogy. This deeper appreciation and connection will enable us to thrive and build our relationships, many of which we would have never had. When we live in an environment that has no walls or limits, the impact of our culture is profound. This is our vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Our next speaker is Max Modiano Daniel with his talk, Southern Tobacconists, Greek Fishmongers, and Japanese Florists, Sephardic Immigrants in the Early 20th Century U.S. Economy. Max Daniel is a PhD candidate in history at UCLA and is currently writing his dissertation, A Sephardic Century, The Transnational Entanglements of a Los Angeles Community, 1893 to 1992. He was the 2018 to 2019 Rabbi Joachim Prinz Memorial Fellow at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was formerly co-director of ucLADINO, actually director as well, and a researcher for the Sephardic Archive Initiative at UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies. His research will be featured in an upcoming book published by Brandeis University Press, as well as in articles for the Jewish Women's Archive and American Jewish History. Welcome, Max.
Thanks, Simone. Let me share my screen so it can begin. Okay. Let's get this set up. All right. So what we'll be talking about today is early 20th century United States and the place of Sephardic Jews, particularly in the economic sphere of the country. So one of the major points that I want to get across today is that when we think about immigration to the US, particularly around the turn of the 20th century, we think about Eastern Europeans, we think about Ashkenazi Jews, and we think about maybe Italians, we think about maybe Polish people. And in the literature and the discussion about Sephardic Jewish immigration, it's very common and it's very understandable that the comparative context would look towards Ashkenazi Eastern European Jews. Look at it in terms of the Ashkenazi immigrant timeline, look at in terms of religious profile or political activity or economic involvement. And kind of what I'm in my research and kind of what I want to try to get across today is that only paints a very limited picture of Sephardic history and Sephardic history in the US. And it actually does a disservice to the uniqueness and the particular ways that Sephardic Jews lived and worked, not only in the US, but in the world in general. And so if we think about Ashkenazi immigration to the US, the standard historiography goes that it kind of begins in the 1880s, beginning with rising anti-Semitism in Russia, in the Russian Empire, the assassination of the Tsar and rising cases of anti-Semitism, as well as lessening economic opportunities. My cat wants to join in the conversation. But really Sephardic immigration, and when I talk about Sephardic, I'm really specifically referring to Ladino-speaking Jews from the Ottoman Empire and former Ottoman lands. It really begins in the 1900s, and especially after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. There were really very few in the 1880s and 1890s. And in addition to that different timeline, it's also more helpful to look at Sephardic life and Sephardic immigration in comparative to other groups from that part of the world, particularly at Greek Americans, and I'll talk about that a lot in a little bit, but also Syrian Lebanese and Armenians, and these are all Christian groups. There are very few Muslim immigrants at the time. And this photo is a picture of Joseph Cohen. He later became one of the owners of the Beverly Hills Four Seasons Hotel. He and his brother got their start selling flowers on the Los Angeles roadside. So to begin with, one place that we can start when talking about Sephardic Jews in the US economy and their particular profile and economic niches is in kind of so-called Oriental rugs. This really is where we get the first evidence, or at least that I found, of Ottoman Jews coming to the US as early as the 1870s, and particularly the Bengiat family from Izmir originally. And it's made up of 5 brothers. And while they arrived in the 1870s, they really kind of flourished through the world's fairs. In Chicago in 1893 and through kind of St. Louis in 1904. And of course, Sephardic Jews were not the only ones selling these kind of Oriental rugs in the US, which was kind of a growing trade and kind of growing interest, especially among the upper class in the US. But Armenians were also known for selling rugs and selling carpets in the US. And on the left is an advertisement in kind of a Sephardic like banquet journal for the Mayorkas brothers. And I recently found out that the current secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, in the US, his great uncles are actually these Mayorkas brothers who imported and were very successful rug dealers in New York. And you can see they have international branches. And so based on what I know about Secretary Mayorkas's family history, it seems that the brothers, his great uncle's success kind of enabled that family to come to Cuba, which is where he was born, which is where Secretary Mayorkas was born, and eventually moved to Los Angeles. And I do want to say one other thing about the Bengiat family is that one of the grandsons of the 5 Bengiat brothers, he became a very popular, very well-known typographer and font designer. He actually passed away in the past year. So I was thinking about, oh, maybe we can get some kind of, there's a history of Ladino speakers and Sephardic Jews in the creation of fonts. And I was just thinking about yesterday's presentation about the Solitreo font. So there's precedent there. So in addition to the carpets and rugs, which as of a couple of years ago, the ones collected by those families are still selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're still very desirable pieces. In addition to those, the World's Fair also brought Turkish tobacco and cigarettes to the American public. And before, Americans were largely smoking like Virginian tobacco and out of pipes or rolling their own cigarettes. And kind of this revolution in smoking was partly due to the introduction of Turkish tobacco and Turkish cigarettes. And one of the main players were several Sephardic Jewish families, alongside working with Greek Americans and Anglo-white Americans as well. So the most famous, the most successful, who became a millionaire is Morris Shinazi, or Musa, or Moise, or Moshe Shinazi. He was born in Manisa, which is kind of a little bit east of Izmir. And he, as a young man, he and his brother, Solomon, moved to Alexandria, Egypt. And for those who may not know, Alexandria, Egypt at the end of the 19th century, it was occupied by the British. It was kind of this international entrepot of Jews from all over, but also Christian Armenians, Arabs, and Greeks and Europeans. It's really this vibrant commercial, international kind of colonial center. And in Alexandria, Shinazi worked for a Greek tobacco firm. I can't really find out exactly what firm he was working for, but he was sent to present Turkish tobacco at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And he and his brother quickly grew it into this massive operation, selling millions and millions of pounds of tobacco grown in Turkey and in Thrace and in Macedonia to American companies. And on the Upper West Side, and really in Harlem, in New York City, he built this great big Ashkenazi factory that employed mostly other Sephardic Jews. And this building is still standing there. It doesn't have these Ashkenazi brothers' names on it anymore. And there's this famous Ashkenazi mansion on the Upper West Side that he built with all his earnings. But Ashkenazi was not the only Sephardic Jew successful and active in selling Turkish tobacco in America. Along with Ashkenazi's nephew, Leon, Maurice Amado, and Greek Americans and it was kind of a Greek and Sephardic firm called Standard Commercial Tobacco Company. They kind of picked up the reins where Ashkenazi left off and basically were the main suppliers of Turkish tobacco to the Reynolds Corporation. And basically, when Reynolds, kind of this old North Carolinian heir to a tobacco fortune, when he introduced Camel cigarettes, he used a lot of this Turkish tobacco from these Greek and these Sephardic merchants to use them. And kind of among the main leaders of this tobacco company was Eri, or Euripides Kahaya, who's in this left here in this kind of damaged photograph, as well as Maurice Amado, a Sephardic Jew from Izmir, and also his family foundation funds a lot of Sephardic studies to this day, including this conference. And so we see kind of this really multi-million-dollar, and this is at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is huge corporation of Greek and Sephardic Jews, or Greek Christians, I should say, specify, and Sephardic Jews working in the US and they really revolutionized the way that Americans consume tobacco. And really the fortune that Amado made, like I said, funded a lot of future research into Sephardic studies, as well as the Sephardic Temple Tiferet Israel in Los Angeles. And part of selling this Turkish tobacco was capitalizing on kind of its so-called Orientalness, or its Turkish, or its Egyptianness. Rarely is mention made that these tobacco magnates are Jews, but these images are American newspaper advertisements. So on the right is kind of almost this full-page advertisement for Ashkenazi Brothers cigarettes, and it has this kind of declaration from the Sultan, like giving him like adoration for his work in the US, and kind of including this really large image of this Ottoman Turkish document. And on the left is an advertisement for another tobacco company that Ashkenazi was involved with, that led by Samuel Benaderet, who's another Sephardic Jew, kind of calling his cigarettes the secret of the Sphinx, and kind of their tobacco is kind of this ancient magical product. And they're really kind of playing up this kind of exoticness of the product. And we really see this in the store that Benaderet, who I mentioned before, who was working with Ashkenazi later, the store that one of these Sephardic tobacco merchants built in San Francisco. And unfortunately, I think it burned down in a fire in the 30s or the 40s. But it was really this, you can see from these photos, even in black and white, how magnificent it was. Kind of this Moorish architecture, these tiles, which were apparently colorful, and the interior you can see on this photo on the right. And it's really kind of playing up this ornate image of the tobacco that they sold. Okay. And so the tobacco merchants and also the rug merchants are some of the more successful and kind of flamboyant, I would say, or kind of focusing more on the image of the product, and the more famous ones. But of course, Sephardic immigrants were not always as successful and not always as publicly visible as Shinazi or Benederet were. And there are also thousands of Sephardic immigrants who worked in kind of what we might call more humble jobs, which were also connected with Greeks. So for those of you either from the Seattle Sephardic community or familiar with it at all, maybe recognize the names of these two men on the right and the left, Solomon Calvo and Jacques Policar, who kind of form the mythology, even though they're real people with real stories, the mythology of Sephardic Seattle, kind of the first arrivals in the early 1900s. And as the story goes, they were brought to Seattle because of a Greek friend that they knew on the island of Marmara. And the Greek friend, I haven't been able to find his name, which is kind of an interesting thing if we think about it, that kind of this Greek connection, this really solid Greek connection. I mean, these Greeks really were essential to bring Sephardic Jews to the US. A lot of these Greeks are kind of forgotten in the narrative. So Jews like Calvo and Policar worked with Greeks, especially in Seattle, in the seafood and the fishing, either usually peddling and selling them. This is an image of Solomon Calvo in the great bushy mustache. And I think it's kind of, I love how he's selling crabs, which for those of you who know about the laws of kashrut and kosher food, the Jews are forbidden to eat shellfish. But this is how Sephardic Jews kind of made their way as immigrants, working alongside Greek and Anglo white Americans as well. And kind of this is a tradition that has largely kind of stepped aside, although today the Amen family still runs Pure Foods, which is in Pike Place in Seattle. So if you go there, you'll still see Pure Foods. And as far as I know, it's still run by descendants of the Amen family. And they still sell lots of treif seafood. In addition, a lot of Sephardic immigrants, particularly from Rhodes, but in general, worked as shoe shines and shoe repair. It's a skill that you didn't really need to know a lot of English to do. And it was also one that was also heavily represented by Greeks. And here you have this so-called Oriental shoe repair shop. Again, kind of like the rugs and the cigarettes, they're not afraid to use kind of this Oriental term to sell their business. And that's kind of a short-lived phenomenon before the Sephardic immigrants kind of realized the extent of anti-Asian racism and that Oriental is not a good thing to be called if you want to be successful in the US. And this has by and large fallen out of favor by a lot of Sephardic Jews and these immigrants' children. But there is kind of one kind of standout store in Seattle, Raymond Angel, who's probably related to the other panelist, Mark Angel, also from a family from Rhodes, is the grandson of kind of this original shoe repair owner. And as far as I know, that business is still in operation in Seattle. But it's really the last of the kind. And apparently Raymond Angel still uses some of the equipment, or at least the techniques that his grandfather brought from Rhodes. And so lastly, I will talk about two interrelated businesses that, particularly in Los Angeles, attracted a large number of Sephardic Jews from Rhodes and from places across the Ottoman and former Ottoman Empire. And really at one point in the 1920s and 1930s, about 2/3 of all employed Sephardic Jews in Los Angeles were working either as in the flower business or in the produce business. And I did this because I did kind of a statistical analysis of the US Census, looking at over 1,000 Sephardic Jews in Los Angeles. And I was kind of shocked by this statistic that such a large proportion of the community who were employed worked in these two industries, which is kind of phenomenal. It's not very diversified, although that changed after World War II. But I've talked a lot about how Sephardic Jews worked with Greek Americans, but in Los Angeles, which even in the 1910s and 1920s was this international city, Sephardic Jews worked alongside and very closely with Americans and immigrants from all backgrounds. And you can see here in this article from the Los Angeles Times in 1918 about fruit dealers, fruit peddlers, they got arrested for violating health codes. And you can see their names kind of indicating who's working, what kind of people are working. You have Japanese names, Kojima and Kobayashi. You have Greek names, Yanni and Papas. You have probably Ashkenazi names, Epstein, Horowitz, and Sephardic names, Caraco and Passy. And it's interesting that Ashkenazi names are here too, because in my research, I found that Sephardic Jews worked alongside Ashkenazi Jews, but are not as significant and perhaps even less significant than Greek Americans, for example, in the economic world of Sephardic immigrants. And soon these peddlers kind of turned their businesses into kind of full-fledged storefronts and grocery stores and chains, not only in Los Angeles, but around the country. Julia and Reuben Hanan, immigrants from Rhodes, settled in Montgomery, Alabama, which some of you may be surprised that had a very lively Sephardic community, particularly Rhodesley. And they had this penny profit meat market for decades, and was kind of an important fixture in the general community in Montgomery, Alabama. And a small piece of interesting trivia is that Reuben Hanan was an adamant supporter of the segregationist governor, George Wallace. He was also involved in kind of rights for aging people as well. So he was a figure in Montgomery in general. Back to Los Angeles, Isidore Haddam, a Sephardic immigrant and entrepreneur from Istanbul, kind of built this great big supermarket chain in the city. It really was a forerunner in introducing supermarkets to an American public. And elsewhere in Los Angeles, Maury Notrica was known for a long time as the owner and operator of several grocery stores, independent grocery stores in Los Angeles. And he kind of maintained his store in Los Angeles, in South Los Angeles, near University of Southern California, really until 2005. And again, was a fixture of the community. Apparently during the 1992 Rodney King uprisings, local people protected the store because they knew that Maury Notrica was a friend, was a valuable asset to the community. And Notrica was known for hiring local youth who could not get hired at the bigger supermarkets. Particularly Black and Latino Americans. And also Maury Notrica was the chairman of the Mexican American Grocers Association, even though he was not Mexican. But he likely knew Spanish through Ladino and was able to build that connection in that way. Moving from, I'll conclude with this last section, moving from produce, Sephardic Jews, particularly in Los Angeles, were really involved in the floriculture industry, selling flowers and really wholesale flowers. And the other group, one of the other groups that's kind of identified with this in Los Angeles are Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans served as the growers. They owned a lot of farms, as well as the sellers. And one of the leading Sephardic Jews in the flower industry was Jack Mayesh and his son, Joe Mayesh. And this is Joe Mayesh at a meeting with Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley of the Flower Market Advisory Committee. And you can see from the names that many of them are Japanese Americans, and Jack Mayesh served as a cantor, as a Hazan for the Sephardic community, and was a musician in his own right. And while he worked alongside Japanese Americans and even wrote a song about Japanese internment called Los Japones, which I haven't been able to find the lyrics of, he also recorded with Greek and Armenian musicians. And here is just one scan of one of his records, with accompanied on oud by an Armenian player, Bozagian. And so I think Mayesh, Jack Mayesh, kind of symbolizes this lost history of Sephardic interethnic economic engagement in the US. He played music with Greek and Armenians. He worked alongside Japanese Americans. And kind of, yeah, so I think Jack Mayesh kind of represents that the place of the Sephardic Jew in this multi-ethnic, multinational American economy. And I kind of track this as a legacy in somewhat to their role in the multinational, multi-religious environment of the Ottoman Empire. And so these Ottoman Jewish immigrants kind of were familiar with this idea, I think, when they came to the US. And some of these businesses are still around today. Mayesh Flowers is like a huge wholesaler today, although they're not owned by the family anymore, but they keep the name. And another Sephardic family, the Muscatels, has kind of a craft and flower store in Los Angeles as well. So I'll end there. Thank you very much to Simone and Rachel for hosting the conference.
Thank you very much, Max. So we're taking questions now, and I have one for Max. It's asking, on the page with the ad for the Shinasi cigarettes, is the writing in Solotreo?
That writing is in Ottoman Turkish, which unfortunately I can't read. But I could see how that you could see that as Solotreo. Yeah.
And you have a couple minutes to submit more questions to the Q&A. I'll give a bit of time, and if we don't get any, then we'll break for lunch a little early.
I'm not able to type questions in the box, but I do have
Go
a
ahead.
question for Mr. Sefami. So I noticed that in your reading, you connected with Orhan Pamuk. Is there a reason why you connected with Orhan Pamuk?
Sorry, not particularly. When I went to Turkey, I read Pamuk before my trip, but I just, for some reason, I needed to read somebody from there, and it had an impact on me.
It's just that Pamuk is very much anti-Erdogan and anti-Turkish, anti-nationalist.
Yeah.
He always talks about the good old times when Istanbul was a very cosmopolitan city, as opposed to now where it's, has been Turkified quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I was trying to see, if there was like a special.
No, but I actually like that, and I perceived when in my trip to Turkey. That was my first trip to Turkey, and I was very impressed by what he was saying. And when I went to Turkey, I felt like he was right.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much to our panelists.
All right, welcome back, everybody. My name is Max Daniel, and I'm a graduate student here at UCLA and former director of ucLADINO, and I'll be moderating this final panel. And before I do, I just want to note and recognize that today is Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel and for Jewish communities around the world, which especially struck Ladino-speaking communities. So I just want to acknowledge and recognize that that is today. So this final panel on linguistics, we have 3 featured speakers that I'm very excited about, 2 of which are return guests. And so I'll just read each person's bio before they present. And for the audience, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A, and then we will get to them at the end of all 3 presentations. And just as a reminder for presenters that each of you have about 15 minutes. So without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Dr. Marcel Israel. Dr. Marcel Israel was trained in industrial controls and telecommunications. Sephardic Jewish, he was born in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, but now lives alternately in Spain and Bulgaria. He speaks Ladino as a native language. The former president of the Religious Council of the Jewish Communities of Bulgaria, he's currently a board member of the Bulgarian Forum for Interreligious Dialogue in Sofia and Religions for Peace Europe in Brussels and Berlin. For about 40 years, he has been working as a freelance scholar in Jewish history and linguistics, presenting multiple scientific contributions at conferences and seminars, recently webinars in different countries in Europe, USA, and South America. Marcel will present on an approach to everyday Ladino words and expressions borrowed from spoken languages in Balkan countries within the Ottoman Empire. Welcome back, Marcel, and take it away.
Thank you. Can I share the screen? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to thank you very much. Thank you very much, Max. Dear friends, we are going to analyze the origin of some simple and everyday Ladino words and expressions from the Balkans. I learned all those words and expressions from my grandmother in Bulgaria. So I'm a native, Ladino is a native language for me. And this presentation will be a practical approach, words and then mixture from other languages in the Balkans. First of all, my gratitude to the organizing committee of this beautiful event. Thank you very much. So, Ladino, let's start. Ladino words originated from Jewish events like festivals, births, and so on, bar mitzvahs. The life of the Sephardim along the centuries, 500 years Ottoman Empire, was together with different ethnic and religious communities like Turks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Bosnians, Macedonians, Albanians, Greeks, and Gypsies, relatively quiet and friendly, and gave a special color and flavor to Judeo-Spanish in every corner of the Balkans. So let's start analyzing some examples. In the preparation and celebration of Jewish events, Ladino words, sayings, and proverbs, including slang, were created. For example, wedding, around wedding. Los novios son como tengere y kapak. That means, from Turkish, you know, tengere y kapak, bride and groom are like pot and lid. They fit each other. Next one. Quien se casa por paras, estas se van, ama la jaragana se queda. That means one who gets married for money, money disappears. But the lazy one, you know, she remains. In the Sephardic neighborhood, there was always a casamentera, the matchmaker. We know this word. And then she spoke about the bride as Hanum Porija, and the groom was Pasha Porijo. Everybody was very nice, and everybody was so nice. Yeah. Let me just move this because I don't know why. Okay. Yeah. In cases of an unsuccessful marriage, the mother used to say, "Mi hija no se casó, ama se encasó fro. Tomó un abanico Zalino." That means my daughter didn't get married happily. She made a very bad choice regarding the groom. He is savage and rustic. Encasonfrarse is a slang, bad marriage. The real word is casarse, get married. But from this, you know, a slang, encasonfrarse. Here, a beautiful picture of a Sephardic wedding ceremony in the synagogue in Sofia, Bulgaria. Let's continue with festive days in Ladino using Turkish, Hebrew, even French. A saying about inadequate behavior. Sarhoshlik año entero y brillando como caranfil en Purim. That means being drunk all over the year and keep sober and shine like a flower on Purim. As we know, where everybody raises the glass in Purim. Next, a saying about an impossible affair. Esto se va a hacer Tisha B'Av la Tadri. That means this will happen on the sad Remembrance Day, 9th of the month Av, in the afternoon. That means almost never. Similar to this is the next one. An impossible thing is expressed with esto va a fitar de mañana mataña. That means never. Tomorrow morning, very early in the morning. That means never. But here, de mañana mataña could probably be from French, demain matin. You see what kind of mixture in the Sephardic language in the Balkans. Next chapter is daily life, about hygiene, health, meals. Once again, we are going to talk to speak Ladino, some words, some sayings, mixed up with Turkish, with Greek, with some languages in the Balkans. About cleanliness, a saying: "Esta camisa está blasca carantonia." This shirt is blasca. Blasca is a slang. The word blanca is white, we know, and blasca means dirty white, even black. Carantonia comes from cara, like in Turkish, black or dirty. And this word is totally different from the current Spanish word carantonia, which means an exaggerated kindness. It's something totally different. Now, Jocha. The stories on Jocha describe Jocha's smartness, normally. But Balkan Jews attributed to this name also a lack of personal hygiene. One in the neighborhood who was unclean got the nickname Jocha. There is a joke. Jocha se fue al baño y contó después 1100 años. That means Jocha's visit to the Turkish steam bath was such an important event to talk about 1100 years. We are continuing with Greek and Turkish words in Ladino, especially Greek and Turkish. This is a very special expression. To a beautiful lady, the Jews from Plovdiv didn't say Hanum, the Turkish word. They said Kolutsko or Morphokoritsko. This expression comes from Greek, but is very Sephardized, modified. The original Greek expression is omorphokoritsi, so quite modified. Next, to a woman who is very nervous and impassioned. The Jews, the Sephardic Jews used to say, andratelo toratelo. That means, I need a man, I need him now. It sounds incorrect Greek, antrastelo toratelo, but this is frequently used by the Jews, by the Sephardim in Plovdiv. The Ladino word for good and diligent housewife is nikochera. It comes from Greek, nikokira. This lady could be also very smart and could haggle in shopping. So, using Turkish, puede ser pazarlik, haggle, and alışveriş, and then shopping. Yeah. Apron, for example, apron. In the housewife apron, the name is prostella, and it is a Greek word, from Greek. Let's go to some Sephardic dishes. We know they are very delicious and famous. And in Bulgaria and in the Balkans, the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, they used a lot of Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian, Serb words about for the ingredients. A very interesting linguistic example. 3 totally different names for the same thing. Wine leaves, grape wine leaves, stuffed with rice and minced meat. We know this. So 3 different names for the same thing. They have sarma, means rolls, Turkish. Dolma means stuffed, Turkish. Yaprak means the wine leaf. It's a 3 different names for the same thing. Let's go to chapter 3, funny Latino words, expressions, proverbs. The green peas are called bizeria in the Balkans. The Sephardic Jews. Comes from Turkish bezelye. A funny saying, que miseria, hoy comemos bizeria. You understand what we mean. Now, it's a very, very interesting word. A scholar from Vienna, Joseph Passy, visited some Bulgarian cities around 1897 and collected Sephardic proverbs from Pilibet, Plovdiv, and Tatar Pazarji. One of those is, Quien quiere asno sin kusur, se va a piringo. You want a donkey with no defect, then go walking. Now, kusur is Turkish, that means defect. Apiringo is not clear. We use apiringo for go walking, but we don't know, still don't know the origin. It's not clear. Maybe it's Greek, but it's not clear. So, more funny Ladino words, expressions, with mix up with Bulgarian, Turkish, even Gypsy Roma. For example, they say nothing, they say nanai. Nanai is from Gypsy Roma. Aide paidos means go away, get lost, from Greek or Turkish. Drumangela, get lost, from Greek and Gypsy or Turkish. Paitak is somebody with knock knees, X-legs. This is from Turkish. And Yustaban is Turkish, means a flat foot. Rare Sephardic names and surnames. It's a chapter, important chapter about the Sephardic surnames. And I'm going to show you some rare surnames. Yulzari. The origin of, there are some families Yulzari. My mother was Yulzari, for example. The origin is probably from Spanish rosanes, roses. modified in the Balkans to gül zarif, that means elegant, nice rose, or gül zari. Turkish gül is rose, and Hebrew zari is foreign or strange. The very famous name today, Burla, the CEO of Pfizer, comes from Greek, Vurla, the Greek name of the Turkish town Urla in the Bay of Izmir. There is another Turkish folkloric interpretation, and could mean good luck also, but folkloric is interpretation. Some more rare Sephardic names and surnames. Karabiber is a Sephardic surname, means black pepper in Turkish. Kuyumcu means jeweler in Turkish, and Çiçek is some surnames in Bulgaria. Çiçek is flower in Turkish. So our last slide, last but not least, is about music. Across the centuries, Sephardic songs and tunes became the basis of interesting composers' works we are proud about as Sephardic. For example, Beethoven composed a cycle of songs named Lieder verschiedener Völker in German. That means songs of various nationalities or different peoples, something like that. Which in this cycle, we can find 5 songs in Spanish and 1 in Portuguese, written 1811, something like that. The question is whether some old Sephardic tunes might be the origin of Beethoven's songs. It's a very nice question. So I started to compare them with multiple Sephardic songs. And this is quite difficult. There's no coincidence and so on. But the musical structure, mood, and melody of Beethoven's song, Seus lindos olhos, it's in Portuguese, your beautiful eyes, is quite very similar to Sephardic songs like Morenica, Morenica, or La Rosa Enflorece. And my last sentence here is, this is just the beginning of this study, which I would like to continue as a tribute to our Sephardic culture and to Beethoven, which 250th birthday we celebrated last year. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Marcel. I think it was exactly 15 minutes or close to that. So our next presenter is Ray Romero. Dr. Romero is Associate Professor of Spanish Linguistics at the University of Houston downtown, where he directs the Translation and Interpreting minor. Dr. Romero believes that the field of sociolinguistics should be central in analyzing the implications of language policy, social justice, and their legal and health ramifications. Dr. Romero holds BAs in Spanish language, linguistics, and French language from Rice University, a PhD in Spanish linguistics from Georgetown University, a graduate certificate in public health from the University of Texas, the Health Science Center, and an advanced professional analytic linguist certificate from Montclair State University. He has conducted fieldwork on Judeo-Spanish in Istanbul and New York City. He has presented his research in over 50 conferences and symposia, including past ucLADINO ones, and he has published 18 peer-reviewed articles on Judeo-Spanish. His book, Spanish in the Bosphorus, a sociolinguistic study on the Judeo-Spanish dialect spoken in Istanbul, from 2012, documents language shift among the Sephardic community in Istanbul. Dr. Romero will present on linguistic justice and Judeo-Spanish revitalization. The floor is yours, Dr. Romero.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
So just a quick outline of my presentation. I will talk about different approaches to revitalization. I will also talk about linguistics justice as social justice. I will talk about how linguistics justice is in theory and how it can be applied in practice. And then I'm going to talk about the benefits of incorporating linguistic justice in revitalization efforts. So the approach to revitalize a language really depends on what is the motivation, what it is that you want to do with the language. So there are different ways, there are different kinds. You can talk about linguistic assimilation. In other words, everyone, regardless of origin, should learn the dominant or official language. And this can compare to English-only policies in the United States, and also bilingual, in quotations, or transitional education, which is kind of when they have bilingual courses for immigrants or other groups, but really their intent is not to teach both languages, but to slowly transition the kids, usually as children, to speak only English. Then you have linguistic pluralism, which is a little bit more what I will be talking about. This is complete or partial bilingualism in society, either at domain or territorial level. That means either there's some parts of the country where both languages are spoken and they're tolerated, or the use of language in certain circumstances is also tolerated or even expected. So you can talk about bilingual education or countries that have co-official languages, and also the providing translation services, especially social services to minority groups or linguistic minority groups. Um, then you have linguistic restoration or vernacularization. This, of course, doesn't happen very often. This is the adoption of a First Peoples language as co-official or official. And some examples are Maori in New Zealand, Guarani in Paraguay, and perhaps even Hebrew in Israel, where languages that were native to those areas were made official or co-official. Finally, you have linguistic internationalism, which is where a non-indigenous language it's used for trade or education or even government or other areas. So a good example of that would be English in India and then French in West Africa. So we'll be talking mostly about linguistic pluralism. And then within this particular pluralism, there are two different approaches that it can be instituted. You can have a bottom-up or a top-down approach. The bottom-up approach, also known as the grassroots approach, basically the community will lead the effort. You will get input from very different parties, and you're going to have different varieties of the language that are going to be participating. This will make a standardization very difficult because no one will probably agree on which variety to incorporate or to take as a model. There will be many different actors and it will be non-centralized. And examples of these, for instance, if you look at the very beginning of Judeo-Spanish revitalization, you're going to find a lot of communities that publish their own newsletters with sections in Judeo-Spanish. Later on with YouTube, you're going to find YouTube videos of individuals who just want to preserve the language. They go out there and they put their YouTube videos speaking in Judeo-Spanish. So a lot of that is community-based. Then you also have top-down approach. A top-down approach, basically an institution, whether it's governmental or educational, will lead the efforts and they're the ones in charge. They come up with a standardization model and it's imposed. There will be gatekeepers and gatekeepers in the community. They will act as the main agents. Gatekeepers are people who act as leaders of the community, and they basically are intermediaries between the world or the community at large and certain groups of the community. And we can talk about that if you have any questions about who they are or what they do. Examples of these are Ladino Comunidad, which is the online listserv in Judeo-Spanish. That was basically the idea came out of the Autoridad Nacional de Ladino, which was trying to find a way to promote the use of the Latin alphabet to write Judeo-Spanish. And then you also have other institutes like Instituto Cervantes, who they basically have, kind of like on their own, they do a lot of Sephardic related activities. So linguistic justice as social justice. First of all, we need to see what we understand by social justice. You can look at these definitions, but real quickly, I can tell you the main focus is the equitable sharing of power and benefits. So we talk about fair and just relations between the individual society. Other themes are distribution of wealth, having equal social and personal opportunities, being aware of social privileges. We talk about human rights and equality. There's quite a difference between equality and equity. You can see that in the picture, that in equality, everybody gets the same, but in equity, everybody gets as they need. There's also an emphasis on diversity and reconciliation, kind of sort of try to make amends with those populations that have been affected. And there have been a lot of recent efforts in several disciplines, like in healthcare, education, law, bioethics, environmental science, that try to take a social justice approach. So why not in linguistics as well? And why not in language revitalization? So this is related, linguistics justice is related to social justice because we can talk about equitable. The language access is not available in no social services. So we need to fix that. The distribution of wealth, non-English speakers must invest time and money to learn English. So once again, a population, because of language, has to do certain expenses. Social and personal opportunities, specific language varieties favor for employment. You know, if you are in this country, it is preferred that you speak English for your employment, and not just English, but a particular kind of English. So if you speak African American vernacular English, you will not have the same opportunities for employment as if you speak Michigan English or Midwestern English. Social privileges, human rights and equality, equity and diversity. Linguistic discrimination is rampant in the United States. It's everywhere. I mean, if you like, we can talk about that. But if you look, if you just use Google News and you type in Spanish language, you're going to find a lot of incidents of people who have been pretty much attacked or verbally attacked for speaking Spanish in public. Nowadays, we even have, now with the Asian populations, you also have a lot of linguistic discrimination against people who are speaking Asian languages. And then reconciliation. Very little has been done to address the needs of linguistic minorities in this country. We do really need to talk about that and remember that the United States is not only a nation of immigrants, but it's also a nation of expansion. It expanded west all the way to California and beyond to Alaska and Hawaii. So the rights of those linguistic minorities need to be acknowledged and they need to be addressed. Within the practice, or I'm sorry, within the theory of linguistic justice, we can talk about this article by Famparius, 2002, and he takes very much economics perspective. He tries to be very much unbiased, and he tries to look at it from an economic point of view. And there are three concepts that I like from this particular article. He has published a lot more after this, but one of them is the idea of free writing. And basically he says that speakers of the dominant language benefit economically when a minority language speaker learns the dominant language. So if I don't speak English, I come to this country and I invest time and money to learn English, then everyone that I make business with, everyone that I purchase things from will benefit from my bilingualism, but they didn't do anything about it. They benefit from my actions without having to put any of the effort. So they're free riding on my effort and they're free riding on my time. Permanent commuting, speakers of a minority language are constantly learning the dominant language. And even when you acquire the dominant language, like me, who acquired English, it's still not quite exactly 100% the variety that is spoken. You know, I have an accent, so even when I have an accent, I will suffer for that. And so he says that speakers of the dominant language should finance this. They should finance the learning of the dominant language. And then minority language maintenance. Speakers of the dominant language should finance efforts to preserve the minority languages because it's not fair that they lose their home language in favor of the dominant language. On the contrary, the speakers of the dominant language should finance efforts to keep it. So how would this look like in theory for Judeo-Spanish revitalization? Well, in a perfect world where all the laws are applied and you can talk about, you know, what will be the ideal situation. In that particular world that doesn't quite exist, then the governments of Spain, Portugal, Greece, Serbia, Turkey, France, and other nations, including the United States and Israel, they will finance revitalization efforts, because all these nations have been the homes of Sephardic diaspora. And in all these nations, Judeo-Spanish was lost or is considered in danger because of their official languages, and not just for economic purposes, but also the loss of a language has a lot of health ramifications as well. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. The local governments of Spain and Portugal, they should share their revenues that they get from the museums, historical sites, and monuments related to Sephardic past. So if you go to Spain, you're going to find a juderia in almost every city, and it becomes a touristical attraction. But of course, the money is not shared with the Sephardic community at large, or even used to preserve Judeo-Spanish. It all goes back, but even though that used to be the Jewish quarter. And then Spain should also compensate monetarily any missteps against the Judeo-Spanish in their citizenship laws, including compulsory dialect modification, the purchase of property in Spain, and mandatory residence in Spain. All these things that were required to become a citizen of Spain and therefore an EU citizen that were put into Spanish laws, that some of them were revoked, but however, because of these laws, a lot of Sephardic Jews lost their Judeo-Spanish dialect in favor of the Castilian dialect spoken in the peninsula. And they later revoked this particular requirement, but too little too late. This is how it would look in an ideal world. But how would it look in practice? In practice, this is something that can actually be done and that we should keep in mind to try to do. We should try to incorporate the community in the top-down approaches. And the golden rule is nihil de nobis sine nobis. This is a Latin phrase, which means nothing about us without us. So if something that's affecting the community should participate in it. So you can include surveys and town halls to collaborate on decision-making and organization bylaws, the composition and policy goals. If they're gonna do something with the Sephardic community, the Sephardic community should have a say-so in these particular policy goals. It could be at any step, whether it's codification, standardization, modernization, or implementation. And we can talk about those steps if you like. Organize a steering advisory committee representing members from all different varieties of Judeo-Spanish backgrounds. Conduct surveys to see what are the actual needs and what are the insecurities and pressures that are affecting the community, and apply checks and balances on gatekeepers. I would prefer that gatekeepers are rotated, that it's not always the same person in charge, but that there's some sort of rotation so that there's a variety of interests, there's a variety of agenda that are being used. And also train gatekeepers, because a lot of gatekeepers who are in charge of language revitalization are not linguists themselves, or they have very minimal linguistic training. So many times, even if their intentions are good, they may be causing harm because they don't have the training that they need. What about academia? We work at universities. I'm a professor, I work at a university. All my research is in academia. So we really need to incorporate linguistic justice in academia. So we need to incorporate the community at every step of the research, from anything from identifying the research questions, use the labels that are susceptible to the community. For instance, a lot of community members do not like the word Ladino for the Judeo-Spanish language. They say, I don't know what Ladino is, yo hablo español, or yo hablo maestro español. So we have to respect those labels. We cannot go there and impose labels and no, you speak Ladino. Like, who am I to tell you what you speak? You are the owner of your language. You get to choose whatever label you want to give it. If we work with the community, we can identify taboo topics, questions that maybe they don't really pertain to this community. Something that I would really like to do is to include them in the ethical review. A lot of research needs to go through an ethical review. It would be very good if the community is also involved in the ethical review of research. Data ownership, who owns the data? We go out there in the field, we interview Judeo-Spanish speakers. Who gets to keep this data? Who gets to decide what to do with all these recordings and all this data? And finally, share results. When you have results, try to share them and try to portray them or try to shape them in a way that it will help the community, whether by creating instructional materials or any other kind of materials. A lot of times research can be used to write grants that can help provide the community with more resources. So try to make your research tailored so that it will help the community that you're working with. And that would also help empower the community. Use research to dispel linguistic myths. There's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of linguistic myths about Judeo-Spanish that are not true, but they're spread all over the place. One of them is like the Judeo-Spanish, that they speak like Cervantes. That is not true. That Judeo-Spanish is not a fossilized language. It continued changing throughout the centuries, and it looks not, I mean, it looks somewhat, but it's not the same as 15th century Spanish or 14th century Spanish. Try to dispel any kind of negative social linguistic attitudes, provide bias-free and realistic assessments and interventions. So all this data can help the community to better prepare. And what will be the benefits? Well, you get to have a more equitable, fair, and just treatment of all the varieties of the language. You have community representation. You have community inclusion in research. You have the creation of didactic materials that the community can actually use, and not didactic materials that are presenting an ideal version of the language. You will have the version that is actually used in the community, a more realistic approach to the current status, interventions, and areas of improvement. And then multi-level governance assures that no one point of view or agenda is favored. When you have, different people participating, when you have committees instead of only one person, you get to have different points of view, and you get to have a better inclusion of the community. So to conclude, I'll give you two quick examples. One of the issues was the standardization of Judeo-Spanish spelling with Latin characters. And the Autoridad Nacional de Ladino decided to do this, and they adopted the Latin alphabet using Aquí Jerusalem magazine. The problem is that this standardized spelling entails standardized pronunciation, and as you know, not all Ladino varieties pronounce the same word the same way. For instance, it wouldn't be optimal for Greek and Balkan dialects. For instance, in some dialects, they say azer. In other dialects, they say fazer or ijo and fijo. So the solution would be, if we were to include these different varieties, we can put them in, we can include alternate spellings as equals. In other words, no one spelling is favored. And also we can also include pronunciation guidelines in the beginning of, for instance, a dictionary that can also help those dialects that have those changes. So an example of dictionary entry would be this, azer, and then in parentheses, fazer, or vice versa. And then the examples will include both dialects, quesites, papoviso, una beraja, things like that. Guidelines in monastery dialects, unstressed vowels are raised. So examples of how, even though it's the same spelling, they could be pronounced differently by different dialects. And finally, an issue that comes very dear to my heart is the Judeo-Spanish and the Spanish linguistics canon. If you pick up any book on Spanish linguistics, there will be a mention there of Judeo-Spanish, but usually it's included in the Old Spanish section. It's included in the very beginning when they're discussing the changes from Latin into Spanish. It's really set so that the student believes that Judeo-Spanish is a relic of the past. And that really angers me, because sometimes it's not even mentioned at all, but if it's mentioned, it's put there in the historical linguistics section, but it is a modern language. It's a language that's spoken today. So a solution would be to include modern examples of Judeo-Spanish text, and we can place it in the same section as they place Spanglish, because Spanglish is language mixing, and so is Judeo-Spanish. It's language mixing with Turkish, with many different other languages. You can put it in the language mixing section. You can put it in the endangered varieties, like where Spanish in the Philippines is. It's an endangered variety. Or just Spanish is an international language. There are Sephardic communities who speak Spanish who are located all over the world. That's an international variety of Spanish. So that is my presentation, and I would take questions, I guess, at the end of the panel. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Romero. So our final panelist is Belgin Dinç. Belgin is a practicing lawyer in Istanbul, and she decided to follow her passion and start her master's degree in linguistics at the University of Boğaziçi. Her thesis is on the syntax of Ladino. She is thankful to have started this study to give her a deeper understanding of her country's culture and history through the study of language. So welcome, Belgin, and you can take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. Today, I will be talking about borrowed verb morphology in Ladino. I will try and share my screen now. I chose the word Ladino, not for any specific purpose. And I refer to the language as spoken in Turkey today. So to begin with, I will make an explanation on the phenomenon of loans and loan verb typology in the literature. Then I will present my data, and then I will try to provide an analysis of the morphology of verbs in Ladino. So what is the phenomenon of loan? So this definition, I took it from Matras. A borrowing or a loan is replications of a linguistic structure in a new extended set of contexts, understood to be negotiated in a different language. So during this process of replication, the language not only plainly copies, it is context bound, and the outcome is open to modifications, adaptations, and changes. So as verbs are morphologically more complex units, most of the time their borrowing requires incorporation strategies to adapt in the recipient language. So 4 types of loan verb integration strategies have been proposed in the literature. I will use Wolgamut's definition here. The first one is direct insertion. In this case, the language retains the original form of the verb and no adaptation is needed in the recipient language. In indirect reception, there is a morphological modification and inflectional patterns apply. And many other languages use what we call the light verb strategy. So the borrowed verb is accompanied by an inherited light verb. And as a result, a complex construction emerges. And the final one, and the rarest one, is paradigm insertion transfer. The loan verb is transferred along with its inflectional morphology in the recipient language. So I will present the basic data about the Spanish and Ladino. And the reason I am also including Spanish is that, first of all, I am including Spanish as a comparison as long as their structures are the same. And when their structures are different, I will mention it. And it is convenient to benefit from the literature on Spanish. Obviously, there is more literature on the Spanish language than on the Ladino language. So we have 3 inflection classes of verbs in both Spanish and Ladino, according to their endings. The first one is R verbs, like pasar, regalar. We've got adverbs and irverbs. So all loan verbs in both Spanish and Ladino fall in the R group, which is the regular conjugation group. I gave some examples of loan verbs in Spanish, like chatear, to chat, from English, tuitear, again from English, to tweet. Also in Ladino, they are in the R group. Some examples are here. Yakışer, it's from the Turkish verb yakış, to sweat. Uydurear, make something up. And çalışer. So when we look at these verbs, they all end with the morpheme AR. But also we see with the borrowed verbs, and ending with "der." And that is a phenomenon attested only in Ladino and not in Spanish. And these endings mark that the verb is borrowed from Turkish. Like these examples, soy der, to peel, from Turkish soy, patla der, from Turkish patla. So we see two types of morphemes in borrowed verbs in Ladino. They either end in "er" or in "der" morphemes. So we will analyze this morphology, but before that, if I make a reminder of the loan verb integration typology, we can straightforwardly rule out the third and fourth types, because apparently Ladino doesn't use a light verb or doesn't use, it has its own inflectional morphology. But we will see that. So for this moment, the candidates are either direct insertion or indirect insertion. So let's take a look at the morpheme "er." There is some literature on this morpheme about Spanish. So as I said, it's present in both Ladino and Spanish. And this morpheme, especially the A part, functions to create verbs in Spanish. It can create verbs from nouns, the nominal verbs, like humo, humear, from smoke to smoke. It can create verbs from adjectives, like in blanco, blanquear. It can create verbs from verbs, correr, corretear, to run and to run around. And then there's some exceptional usage with pronouns like tutear. So we can say that the similar pattern holds in inherited vocabulary of Ladino. When I say inherited, by the way, I mean vocabulary not borrowed. So these are some examples from Ladino. You can do asco, asquear, from nouns to verbs. You can do the adjectival verbs, estiedro, estiedriar. And again, you can create verbs from verbs with er, chupar, chupetear. So this AR ending is the most common way of accommodating neologisms in Spanish from English, and also in Ladino from Turkish, like in tutear. And then here I gave a full sentence from Ladino from a corpus that we have in our university. Ningún las estaría culaneando. Here you have the verb culanear, but as it's conjugated here, you have the stem, Turkish stem kulan, with meaning to use, and then you have e, and you have the gerund. Means no one would be using them. So as we see the normal inflectional patterns of the language, of the recipient language, which is like the gerund here, for example, I conclude that the accommodation strategy of verbal borrowings in Ladino and Spanish is indirect insertion instead of direct insertion. So a verbalizing affixation is applied to the received verb. And now let's take a look at this morpheme "der." This is only attested in loan verbs in Ladino from Turkish, and clearly in the speaker's mind, the "der" morpheme is associated with loan verbs from Turkish. So we've got the same ending "ar", and then we have this additional segment. So we'll try to figure out what this D segment is coming from. When we look at other languages in the region, in Asia Minor or in the Balkans, we encounter similar morphology in borrowed verbs. So Becker and Matras have observed that in Greek and Romani, which are spoken in Asia Minor and in the Balkans, you see the D sound between the root and the inflection of the borrowed verbs. So Becker studies Sepegides Romani, which is spoken in Izmir, Turkey. They use din, tin as a loan verb suffix between the stem and the personal inflection. And also in many varieties of Greek spoken in Asia Minor, Cappadocian Greek, Farashid Greek, and Sille Greek, they also use D to adapt borrowed verbs, the same segment. Some examples from Cappadocian and Farashid Greek. So from Turkish, düşünmek, düşün is the stem. There's the D segment, and then we see the verbal inflection. Anla, anladizo. Or in Farashid Greek, yaşamak, yaşado, etc., etc. So Becker and Matras argue that this D is the preterite marker of Turkish. And Becker argues that Romani has actually borrowed this pattern from Greek. So Romani did not borrow this D segment from Greek, but the language borrowed the borrowing pattern. So it is not morphological borrowing as such. Matras, on the other hand, argues that it is morphological borrowing, but the difference is the function of the sound has changed. The D in Turkish is the preterite marker, which is inflectional, whereas Matras says that in these borrowing languages, it's only a derivational marker that identifies the foreign origin of the verb. So my conclusion is that this D is the preterite marker of Turkish in verbal borrowings in Ladino too. So we are facing an aerial borrowing pattern. So Ladino uses the same borrowing pattern from Turkish as the other languages of the region, which all borrow from Turkish. So these verbs, that they are verbs, are borrowed as stems from Turkish, and then the tense and person are marked through inherited inflectional morphology. Here I give another example from Eleman Eser, like patlar, to burst, from Turkish, patladeyan dose, with the reflection. So there is also a phonological exemption for the morpheme there in Ladino, and I believe that this supports my argument that the D segment is coming from Turkish. So the general phonological rule in both Ladino and Spanish is that when the alveolar voice stop, which is D, is followed by a vocoid is either a vowel or a glide, like y, it becomes a vocoid spirant, so an interdental v. This sound v is absent in the Turkish sound inventory. So in a verb like boya değer, which comes from boya in Turkish, to paint, and then we see the D segment again. If the D part belonged to the inherited vocabulary, we would expect, according to normal phonological rules, as it's between two vocals, we would expect it to become interdental, the. So we would expect to pronounce it boyadear, but the reality is they pronounce it as boyadear, so it remains as an alveolar. And to compare, when an inherited suffix, the agentive suffix dor is added to the verb, boyadeador, it means building painter, we see the same phonological operation. So the in the suffix becomes an interdental, but the first segment, that marks the borrowed verb, remains as alveolar. So I believe this also supports my argument. So what we see is a contact-induced change in phonology of the language. So to conclude, I will make a resume of the verbal borrowing morphology in Ladino. So Turkish verbs are received by the language through indirect insertion. A modification in the verb necessarily takes place either by adding only the affix e, which is a verbalizer, or the affix de, and then the affix a. De is a stem-forming affix, which marks in Ladino that the verb is borrowed from Turkish. The original function of the segment is the preterite marker in the donor language. However, this function is lost when the receiving language adopts this morpheme. Even when the loan verb marker de is added to the stem, the loan verb needs to be verbalized with e. And to conclude, the borrowing phenomena in Ladino supports the general tendency of an aerial borrowing pattern in Asia Minor. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Belgian. So now we would like to open the Q&A section, although it's been open already, but we will give some time for people to submit questions in the audience, and I will read them out as they come in. Let's see. And our panelists are also welcome to ask questions to each other. Let's see. Okay, there's a question for you, Belgian. Brian Kirshen wonders if you can tell us about the corpus or corpora you're using and how many verbs you have identified ending in "-dar" in Ladino.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also adds, in regard to your observations about the realization of "de," is this based on an analysis of oral data?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think I'm still sharing my screen, is that right?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
More.
So the corpora that I'm using is oral, and some of these verbs are also in dictionaries. This in general depends on how old the borrowing is, or whether the borrowing, whether there's the borrowing makes a distinction between the inherited vocabulary and the borrowed vocabulary. But some of them are not in the dictionaries, or they wouldn't even use it in written corpus like El Amanecer, because in the publication in Turkey called El Amanecer, they try to use a more controlled language. But whereas during speaking, they might use any Turkish verb and integrate it into their language. And then what was the other question? How many verbs? Okay, actually I have a list and I'll try to find it and open it for you. So I have like a 2 pages list. I didn't count them with verbs ending in AR. And I have a lot shorter list for there, which is like around 10 verbs. And actually, an interesting question would be to study how these AR and DR endings are distributed. So whether they are rule governed. I didn't really reach a conclusion about that, so I didn't want to include that in this presentation, but it is an interesting study for further question for further study.
Max, I also have a question for Belgin, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
So that the T infix between the root and the infinitive, it was common in medieval Spanish, and you can still hear it in some Spanish words, like tutear. That T in tutear is an infix. Also in the word tetera, for like te means tea. So that T comes between the te and the era, which is agent suffix. You also have it in corretear. So it is something that does happen in Spanish. It's not necessarily something that may have come from Asia Minor or from Greek. Also remember that in order to borrow things like inflection, there has to be a very high degree of contact. And from what I know about the history of the Sephardic in Turkey, they really weren't obligated to learn Turkish until early 20th century. But you will have patladyar and other verbs like that before that time period. So maybe something to consider is maybe not to see it as something that it's Asia Minor, or it's something actually very much Spanish.
So the verbs that you say that exist in also medieval Spanish, I took them as inherited verbs. Also, I put them in my presentation. And this segment, it's always verbs from Turkish. So, and in the speaker's minds, it's so clear, no discussion that the exists in verbs from borrowed from Turkish. So what I tried to say was, my argument is that the segment within the verbs that are borrowed from Turkish is the preterite marker, which is also coherent with the other borrowing patterns in the region.
Marcel, did you want to? I saw you had your hand. So you're muted, Marcel. Yeah.
Just two words. First, to thank you, Belgian. It was very, very good. But something, the Ladino words in Bulgaria built from from Turkish or using Turkish. We use a lot of the suffix G for for example, you said boyadear, and we say boyadear, but we say also boyaji. Boyaji. Using the G
but
is.
Does boyaji mean the person selling paint?
Or who is who is painting? The boyaji is who is painting. Yeah. Okay. We use a lot of this G. And so in this case, and then to Ray, just 2 words. about Ladino in many countries in Europe. You know, in the Balkans, this is flourishing in Serbia, in Bosnia Herzegovina, in Turkey, you know, in Greece. But you know, the weakest point of Ladino is Spain. We speak Ladino in Spain, maybe 5 persons, Ladino now. Because the Jews in Spain, they are from Morocco and they speak Haketia. And they don't speak Haketia, they don't know. There are maybe 2 or 3 persons, 3 guys speaking Haketia. So the Jews are from Morocco. So Ladino, it's funny that we came from Spain 500 years ago. Ladino is a weak place. Is the weakest place in Ladino is Spain. Can you imagine? So thank you very much, dear friends. Thank you.
I think we're running low on time, but I do want to ask my own question for Dr. Romero, especially because he's talking about revitalization. And I don't know if you have heard, or I'm sure people in the audience may have heard that Duolingo, like the popular smartphone application for learning languages, they just launched a Yiddish language unit. And I was wondering, that just made me think about for revitalization, specifically about education, if that is part of this conception.
I think it can be, as long as it's, I think the point that I was trying to make is that a lot of the top-down approaches, they really need to incorporate the community. They cannot just be 1 or 2 people in charge of language revitalization. With apps like Duolingo, and I think, I mean, that would be really nice if you had a Ladino in Duolingo, but then you have to wonder, you know, which variety are you gonna use? Which kind of spelling are you gonna use? Who's gonna make those decisions? You know, who's gonna make the recordings? All that needs to be a collective decision. It cannot be a single-handed enterprise. I once met someone from Turkey who decided to make their own alphabet for Judeo-Spanish. And it was almost like a lone wolf campaign. You know, it was like, I'm gonna revamp the Latin alphabet used for Judeo-Spanish. And I'm like, but who's gonna use it? You know, like what is the purpose of this? You know, you need to consult the community. And so I think it would be really great if we just talk to each other more and participate more. I recently found out that now the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language has a branch in Israel for Judeo-Spanish. And honestly, I don't see the point of that. Like who elected them? Who made them kings? You know, like they're not, I mean, what is the role that they're trying to play? And even though, you know, every little help that we can get to help the language alive and revitalize, it's very much appreciated, but it needs to be done right. And it needs to be done in a very pluralistic and democratic manner.
Great. So I think in the interest of time, and it looks like there are no more questions in the Q&A, I want to thank our panelists, Marcel Israel, Ray Romero, and Belgin Dinch, and hand it over to Simone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your talks. So what I'm about to play for you is sort of a work in progress. It's sponsored by the Lowell Milken Fund for the the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience and the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies. Generally, what we do for ucLADINO is that we have the choir that I direct Cantigas Muestras perform. But that wasn't possible this year, as rehearsals are always, they're just taking place on Zoom, and we haven't sung together for a year. So what I've done instead is assembled a group of musicians to make a mini concert for you. So I'm gonna play what we have, and in the chat, I will post the lyrics to the songs so that you can sing along if you want. There's 4 songs. The first one, I think you know, 7 Ways to Cook Eggplant. The second song, I took a Turkish melody and I wrote my own Ladino lyrics to it about the coronavirus. And we kept the Turkish chorus because that's traditionally what is done when the contrafact is practiced in Ladino music. And after that, I have Si Radieš Alarana, and after that is a Greek rebetiko tune in which I found Ladino lyrics in a book of poetry, and they happened to match up exactly with the lyrics, or with the, let's say, the rhythms in this one. So I hope that you enjoy it, and look in the chat. I'll be posting things here. The credits are in the chat now as well. Thank you. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. I will pass it off to Rachel now for her closing remarks.
Hello, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the second day of our conference. I'm Rachel Smith. I'm a co-organizer of this year's conference together with Simone, and I'm going to be closing us out with some very short remarks. So today, like Max mentioned, is Holocaust Memorial Day, when we commemorate the Holocaust, which, as many of us know, really caused great destruction across the Sephardic heartland, especially in Greece and the Balkans. And so in some ways, this conference is a tribute to this culture and this history. And as we've seen from the many presentations that we've had over the past 2 days, how rich and textured this history and culture is, and how memories of these people persist in our communities and also in our research. One thing that we've really seen is how the field of Sephardic studies, despite this history and despite this destruction, has an incredibly bright future. Just in the past day, we've traversed the Sephardic world from the Ottoman Empire and Salonica and Plovdiv in Bulgaria, all the way to Seattle and Los Angeles. We've moved from the 15th century in the fantastic Keynote by Dr. Olga Borovaya, very up until the 20th century and today. And it's been so exciting to see all of these new online resources and digital collections and projects. We've spotlighted a couple of them in this conference, and we can especially appreciate them now from our homes during a global pandemic. Projects like University of Washington's Exploring Life Cycle Customs and the Solitreo project at Binghamton University. So it's certainly not the conference that we envisioned having, but it is still so special to be able to gather together online and witness the expansive new directions that scholars are taking in Sephardic studies and research that cuts across history, anthropology, ethnomusicology, linguistics, translation, and in so many other directions. I'd like to thank everyone who's made this conference possible. Thank you to the many musicians and speakers and panel moderators, and to our very generous donors. This conference would not have been possible without support from UCLA's History Department, the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, Spanish and Portuguese Studies, the Center for European and Russian Studies, and of course the Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies. And I would especially like to thank the staff of the Leve Center, Vivian Hollenbeck, Chelsea White, David Wu, and Caroline Luce, for all of their help. And of course, a big, big thanks to my fantastic co-organizer, Simone Salmon, who has spent so much time putting together this conference, not just this year, but the year before too. So we hope to see you all next year in Los Angeles, Shana Ba'a in Los Angeles. And thank you all again. Merci mucho.